Hello there and welcome to Life Beyond Scene, where curiosity slows its pace just enough for the details to come into focus, and science wanders quietly into the corners most maps barely acknowledge. Tonight, we step away from crowded coastlines and well-charted harbours. We drift instead toward places that sit far from shipping lanes, far from city lights, far from the steady hum of highways and airports. We're talking about the world's most isolated bays, not the famous beach resorts, not the postcard marinas, the ones that rest at the edge of continents, tucked behind cliffs, guarded by ice, jungle, fog, or simple distance. The kinds of places where the shoreline bends inward and the outside world slowly fades from relevance. If you pause for a moment and picture a bay, what comes to mind? Perhaps a gentle curve of sand, perhaps fishing boats bobbing quietly at anchor, maybe a sleepy seaside town where the loudest sound at night is the clink of rigging against a mast. Now imagine removing the town, remove the road, remove the harbour master, the ice cream stand, the pier and the lights. Strip it back until what remains is only water pressing against land, shaped by geology and time, cut off from constant human interruption. That is where we're going. And before we go any further, I find myself curious. Where are you listening from right now? Are you near a coastline or far inland where the ocean is only an idea? Is it early morning, or has the day already folded into evening where you are? There's something fitting about that. A conversation about remote bays reaching people scattered across their own small corners of the world. If this kind of slow exploration feels like a comfortable place to spend your time, I'd appreciate it if you gave the video a like and perhaps subscribed. It helps this quiet little channel find others who enjoy learning without rushing. No pressure, of course. We have a long stretch of shoreline ahead of us. Now, when we talk about isolated bays, we're really talking about geography behaving in a very specific way. A bay, in simple terms, is a body of water partially enclosed by land. It can be small or massive. It can open widely to the sea or narrow into something that feels more like a hidden pocket. Isolation, though, is not just about distance. It's about difficulty. A bay might be remote because it sits near the poles, locked in seasonal ice. It might be hemmed in by steep cliffs that make land access nearly impossible. It might lie along a coastline so rugged and irregular that roads simply never made sense to build. Some bays are isolated by climate, others by depth. Some are protected by coral reefs that prevent large ships from entering. Some are reachable only by small boats during certain tides, and some are technically accessible, but so far from any major population centre that few people ever bother to go there. Isolation creates conditions. Conditions create change, and change over time creates something interesting. Let's begin with the basic physical environment. When a bay is cut off from strong ocean currents, its waters can behave differently from the open sea. Temperature can stabilise in unusual ways. Salinity levels can drift higher or lower depending on freshwater inflow from rivers. Nutrients can accumulate. Sediment can settle in thick layers, undisturbed by heavy traffic. In some isolated bays, oxygen levels near the bottom drop so low that only specialised organisms survive there. In the open ocean, currents constantly mix water layers. Surface water warms under the sun. Deeper water remains cold. Storms churn everything together. In a secluded bay with limited circulation, those layers can remain separated. Scientists call this stratification. It creates zones. Near the surface, fish and plankton thrive. Deeper down, life becomes sparse and sometimes nearly absent. The bay becomes vertically organised, almost like a building with different floors, each supporting its own community. Then there is sound. Sound travels differently in enclosed water. Waves reflect off cliffs. Echoes bounce in unexpected patterns. Marine mammals navigating by echolocation must adapt to tighter acoustic environments. In open seas, a whale call might travel for dozens of kilometres. In a narrow bay, that sound may return quickly, distorted by rock walls and shifting temperatures. Over time, isolation can also affect species in more dramatic ways. When populations are separated from the broader ocean, genetic differences can accumulate. A species of fish in one remote bay may gradually diverge from its relatives elsewhere. Slight changes in diet, water temperature, or predator presence can shape body size, coloration, behavior, even reproductive timing. We often associate island isolation with unique evolution. Think of birds on remote archipelagos. But bays can act like aquatic islands. A narrow mouth connecting to the sea functions like a biological filter. Only certain species enter. Once inside, some stay year-round. Others become permanent residents. Predators may be absent. Competitors may be fewer. Under those circumstances, ecological balances shift. There are bays in polar regions where sea ice covers the surface for much of the year. When the ice melts briefly during summer, sunlight floods into nutrient-rich water that has been undisturbed for months. Phytoplankton blooms rapidly. Zooplankton populations surge. Fish gather. Seals and whales follow. For a short window, the bay becomes intensely alive. Then darkness and ice return, and everything slows again. In tropical regions, isolation can mean something entirely different. A bay surrounded by mangrove forests may receive steady inflows of organic material. Leaves fall, roots trap sediment. Juvenile fish shelter among the tangled roots. Sharks patrol quietly in deeper channels. The water may appear calm at the surface, but beneath it, movement continues in layers. Some isolated bays have very little human presence simply because they are inconvenient. No deep water port, no nearby highway, no commercial incentive. These places can become accidental refuges. Species that have declined elsewhere sometimes persist there longer. It's not that they are untouched by global change, but they experience it differently. Yet isolation does not always mean pristine. A bay with limited water exchange can also trap pollutants. Runoff from a small upstream settlement may accumulate instead of dispersing. Nutrient overload can trigger algal blooms. Oxygen levels can drop. Fish can suffocate in events called hypoxic episodes. In these environments, small disturbances can have amplified effects. There is also a psychological dimension to isolated bays. Humans have a complicated relationship with edges. We are drawn to coastlines. We build cities near water. But we are also wary of places that feel cut off. A bay with no visible buildings, no lights at night, no distant engine noise can feel expansive and confining at the same time. You're surrounded by open water, yet enclosed by land. Early explorers often recorded such bays in careful detail, not because they planned to settle them, but because they needed safe anchorage in hostile conditions. A deep protected inlet could mean survival during a storm. Many remote bays appear in navigation logs long before they appear in tourist brochures. In colder regions, glaciers have carved fjord-like bays with steep sides and great depth. These inlets can extend far inland. Fresh water from melting ice flows into salt water below, creating sharp gradients in temperature and salinity. Sediment carried by glacial rivers clouds the water near the surface, limiting light penetration. Below that cloudy layer, ecosystems adjust to dim conditions. In warmer climates, tectonic activity sometimes creates bays through subsidence. Land sinks. Seawater fills the depression. Coral reefs may form around the edges, further isolating the interior waters. Over centuries these structures grow, reinforcing the boundary between bay and ocean. Wind patterns also play a role. Some bays are shielded from prevailing winds by mountain ranges. Surface waters remain calm even when the outer coast is turbulent. That calmness allows fine sediments to settle. It encourages seagrass meadows to establish. It shapes which species dominate. And when storms do reach these bays, the impact can be concentrated. Storm surges push water into the enclosed space. With fewer escape routes, water levels rise more dramatically. Coastal vegetation absorbs the force. Over time, plant communities adapt to periodic flooding. There are bays so isolated that reaching them requires days of travel by boat through rough water. Supplies must be planned carefully. Scientific equipment must be compact and durable. In such places, research teams often describe a distinct sense of disconnection from daily life. Satellite signals may be weak, weather forecasts may be unreliable. The environment dictates the schedule. In those quiet stretches of shoreline, long-term ecological processes unfold without much observation. Predator-prey relationships stabilise or shift gradually. Sediment layers record centuries of change. Microbial communities thrive in niches that might be disrupted elsewhere. Consider what lurks there. Not necessarily monsters or myths, though those stories often arise. What lurks are organisms adapted to specific constraints. Fish that tolerate low oxygen. Invertebrates that anchor in still water. Sharks that patrol narrow channels rather than open ocean expanses. Seals that haul out on rocks rarely disturbed by people. In some bays, underwater caves connect to the open sea. Tides push water in and out through submerged passages. These systems can host species rarely seen outside. The limited light, reduced current and stable temperatures create conditions similar to deeper waters, but closer to shore. Even bacteria and plankton can display localized differences. A single bay can host microbial strains genetically distinct from neighbouring coastal waters. That matters. Microbes form the base of marine food webs. Small changes at that level ripple upward. It is easy to imagine isolation as emptiness, but in ecological terms, isolation often means specificity. Narrow conditions, fine-tuned relationships, life that persists not in spite of constraints but because of them. Human activity, even when minimal, can tip these balances. A new fishing route opens. A small dock is constructed. Tourism increases. Noise levels rise. Species that depended on quiet conditions shift their patterns. Others move in. Isolation begins to erode. Yet some bays remain difficult enough to access that they resist rapid change. They sit on maps as curved indentations with little annotation. To most people, they are just shapes. To scientists, they are laboratories. To the species living there, they are entire worlds. And as we continue moving along this quiet coastline of ideas, it becomes clear that isolation is not a single condition but a spectrum. Some bays are remote but biologically connected. Others are physically close to cities but ecologically separated by barriers like reefs or sills that restrict water flow. Understanding what lurks in these places requires patience. It requires looking beneath the surface. It requires measuring salinity, oxygen, nutrient levels, current speeds, and seasonal variations. It requires listening to underwater soundscapes and sampling sediment cores. Because beneath calm surfaces there are always patterns, sometimes subtle, sometimes dramatic, sometimes ancient. And when we narrow our focus further, when we begin to ask which specific bays on Earth exemplify this isolation most clearly, we start to see how geography, climate and biology converge in particular places, shaping environments that are at once contained and deeply connected to the larger planet. When we talk about isolation, especially along a coastline, it helps to be precise. Not every quiet inlet qualifies. Not every curved stretch of shore earns the label. A bay can be peaceful and still sit within sight of a highway. It can appear remote in a photograph yet receive dozens of boats each week. True isolation, in geographic terms, is less about appearance and more about structure. A bay becomes isolated through a combination of physical barriers, distance from infrastructure, and limits to circulation. These factors work together. They shape how water moves, how species migrate, how people access the shoreline, and how the place changes over time. Start with the most obvious element, the mouth of the bay. The opening that connects it to the larger sea determines a great deal. A wide, open mouth allows strong currents to sweep in and out. It invites ships. It permits migration of large marine animals. A narrow entrance, by contrast, restricts flow. If that entrance is shallow, perhaps defined by an underwater ridge known as a sill, water exchange slows even more. A sill can sit only a few meters below the surface, while the interior of the bay drops much deeper. That means deeper ocean water cannot easily enter. The result is a layered system. Surface water moves with the tides, but deeper water may remain trapped for long periods. Oxygen can decline in those depths. Temperature differences can persist. Geographers map these features carefully. Bathymetric charts reveal the shape of the underwater landscape. In isolated bays, you often see steep drop-offs inside and tight constrictions at the entrance. These are not random. They are the result of glacial carving, tectonic shifts, sediment deposition, or long-term erosion patterns. Consider fjord-like bays formed by glaciers. During ice ages, thick glaciers carved deep valleys into coastal rock. When the climate warmed and ice retreated, seawater flooded those valleys. What remained were long, narrow inlets with steep sides and often a shallow threshold at the mouth. The glacier, as it moved, scraped and deposited sediment. That sediment accumulated near the opening, forming a natural barrier. The interior basin could be hundreds of meters deep, yet separated from the open ocean by a relatively shallow lip. Such geometry creates isolation not only from human access, but from ocean circulation. Water entering must pass over the sill. Deep renewal events happen rarely, sometimes only during strong storms or unusual tidal conditions. Between those events, the bottom waters remain largely cut off. In tropical regions, coral reefs can play a similar role. A bay encircled by reef structures may have only one or two navigable channels. Large vessels cannot pass easily. Wave energy from the open ocean is reduced. Sediment settles. Seagrass beds develop in calmer conditions. The reef itself becomes a biological barrier. Certain species thrive within, others rarely enter. Distance from major population centres adds another layer. Some bays sit hundreds of kilometres from the nearest city. Reaching them may require travel over unpaved roads, followed by boat passage through rough seas. Even if the water is navigable, the logistical effort discourages frequent visits. In parts of northern Canada, Alaska, or eastern Russia, bays are accessible only during short summer windows when ice retreats. For much of the year, sea ice seals them in. That seasonal closure shapes the entire ecological rhythm. Marine mammals may enter during brief productive periods and leave before freeze-up. Human research teams must plan around narrow operational timelines. Wind exposure also contributes. A bay shielded by high mountains can remain calm, while the outer coast experiences heavy surf. That calmness affects sediment patterns and species composition. It also affects human settlement. Historically, safe anchorages attracted small communities. Yet if surrounding terrain was too steep for agriculture or construction, permanent settlement remained limited. River input can isolate a bay chemically even if it remains physically open. Large freshwater inflows reduce salinity in surface layers. This stratification can discourage certain marine species from entering. In extreme cases, estuarine conditions dominate much of the interior. Tides complicate the picture. Some bays experience dramatic tidal ranges. Narrow entrances can amplify tidal currents, creating strong flows that few vessels can navigate safely except at slack water. In other bays, tidal exchange is minimal. Water turnover is slow. Nutrients accumulate differently. Climate influences isolation in quieter ways. Persistent fog can obscure coastal landmarks, discouraging navigation in earlier centuries. Harsh winter storms can make access unpredictable. Regions prone to cyclones or typhoons may see sporadic but intense disturbances that reshape shorelines and sediment layers. Geologic history often explains why certain bays remain cut off. Tectonic uplift can raise coastal terraces, altering drainage patterns and trapping seawater in semi-enclosed basins. Volcanic activity can create calderas that later flood, forming steep-walled bays with limited openings. Human infrastructure, or the lack of it, matters just as much. In some places, rugged terrain prevents road construction. Sheer cliffs drop directly into water. There is simply nowhere to build. Even in technologically advanced societies, cost-benefit calculations determine whether a port is developed. If shipping routes favour other harbours, a bay can remain largely untouched. When you combine these factors, a pattern emerges. True geographic isolation requires more than remoteness. It requires limited exchange, limited water flow, limited species movement, limited human traffic. Satellite imagery reveals these quiet corners clearly. From above, an isolated bay often appears darker in tone compared to open ocean, reflecting differences in depth or sediment. Surrounding land may show minimal signs of development. No grids of roads, no large docks, no clusters of buildings. On land, vegetation patterns often indicate minimal disturbance. Mangrove forests may extend uninterrupted along the shore. In colder regions, mosses and lichens dominate rocky slopes. Animal tracks, rather than tyre tracks, mark the ground. Oceanographers studying such bays deploy instruments to measure temperature profiles. They lower sensors through the water column, recording how conditions shift with depth. In highly isolated systems, they often find sharp thermoclines, abrupt changes in temperature within a few meters. Below these layers, oxygen may drop significantly. Chemical signatures provide further evidence. Nutrient concentrations differ from surrounding waters. In some bays, high levels of organic material settle on the bottom. Decomposition consumes oxygen. The environment becomes inhospitable to many fish species, but favourable to specialised invertebrates and microbes. Isolation can also be seasonal rather than permanent. Monsoon-driven sediment plumes may temporarily block entrances. Sandbars shift with storms, narrowing channels unpredictably. In Arctic regions, ice cover expands and contracts annually, creating cycles of enclosure. Even sound behaves differently. Narrow rock walls reflect low-frequency waves. The acoustic environment becomes complex. Marine animals that rely on echolocation must adapt to shorter echo return times. For scientists, hydrophones record soundscapes that differ markedly from open ocean basins. Cultural geography adds nuance. Indigenous communities in remote regions often know these bays intimately. They understand currents, seasonal changes, and safe passages. To outsiders, the bay may appear forbidding. To those who live nearby, it may represent a reliable food source and a protected harbour. Mapping efforts during the Age of Exploration frequently noted such bays as refuges. Explorers valued sheltered anchorages during storms. However, absence of fertile land or mineral resources limited permanent settlement. Today, some isolated bays remain uninhabited simply because global trade routes bypass them. Container shipping favours deep, accessible harbours near infrastructure. A narrow, shallow entrance disqualifies many otherwise beautiful inlets from economic development. Climate change is altering isolation patterns in subtle ways. Melting sea ice extends navigable seasons in polar regions. Rising sea levels may deepen previously shallow sills, increasing water exchange. Storm intensity may reshape entrances, widening or narrowing channels. Despite these changes, certain geographic features remain persistent. Mountain ranges do not move quickly. Glacially carved valleys maintain their shape. Coral reef barriers continue to define interior lagoons, range from weeks to years, in extreme range from weeks to years. In extreme cases, bottom waters may remain isolated for decades before being flushed. Such long renewal times influence sediment accumulation. Layers build gradually, undisturbed by frequent turbulence. Scientists extract sediment cores from these basins to reconstruct climate histories. Each layer records conditions at the time of deposition, creating natural archives. Isolation also affects predator-prey relationships. Large pelagic predators may rarely enter narrow systems. Smaller resident predators dominate instead. Food webs adjust accordingly. Some bays are isolated vertically as well as horizontally. A freshwater lens may sit atop denser saltwater, limiting mixing. In certain tropical sinkhole-like bays, underwater caverns connect to the sea, but surface openings remain small. These systems can contain distinct microbial communities rarely encountered elsewhere. Even light penetration varies. Turbid runoff reduces clarity. In clearer but enclosed bays, plankton blooms may tint the water green or brown, limiting visibility. Divers report markedly different underwater landscapes compared to open coastal reefs. Weather patterns can be localized. High surrounding terrain may create microclimates. Rainfall distribution differs from adjacent coastlines. These variations influence freshwater inflow and nutrient cycles. In high latitudes, prolonged winter darkness compounds isolation. With limited sunlight, primary productivity drops. Ice cover insulates the water below from wind mixing. When spring arrives, the sudden influx of light triggers intense biological responses. Geographic information systems now allow scientists to quantify isolation metrics. They calculate entrance width relative to basin area. They model water exchange rates. They estimate connectivity indices for marine species. All these measurements reinforce a simple conclusion. A bay becomes truly isolated when physical structure, climate, and limited human interaction converge to reduce exchange with the outside world. It is not merely tucked away, it is functionally distinct. And as we continue exploring these quiet coastal recesses, it becomes clear that isolation is not an absence of activity. It is a different pattern of activity, a reshaping of flows, a slowing of turnover, a narrowing of access. These factors set the stage for what develops within, shaping the life, chemistry, and subtle movements that define the world hidden inside the curve of land and water. Distance does something unusual to life, not immediately, not in a dramatic, cinematic way. It works gradually, quietly. It removes the regular interruptions that most ecosystems experience. It reduces traffic. It narrows contact. And over time, that steady absence of connection begins to shape everything inside the boundary. When a bay sits far from major shipping lanes, far from urban runoff, far from regular fishing pressure, it begins to operate on a different tempo. The silence of distance is not literal silence because water is never truly quiet. Currents move, shrimp snap, fish pulse their swim bladders in low vibrations, wind presses across the surface. But there is an absence of engines, an absence of propellers, an absence of the constant low-frequency hum that now fills much of the world's ocean basins. Marine biologists who deploy underwater microphones in remote bays often report soundscapes dominated by biological noise. Snapping shrimp can create crackling fields of sound. Fish choruses rise at dusk during breeding seasons. Whales pass through during migrations, and their calls bounce off enclosing cliffs. In more connected waters, those sounds compete with shipping noise that travels for hundreds of kilometers. In isolated bays, the acoustic environment belongs mostly to the organisms that live there. Distance also alters migration patterns. Many marine species rely on large-scale ocean currents to distribute larvae. In open coastlines, larvae drift widely before settling. In isolated bays with narrow entrances or limited exchange, fewer external larvae arrive. Recruitment becomes more dependent on local reproduction. Populations turn inward, genetically and ecologically. This inward shift has consequences. Genetic diversity may decline if isolation persists long enough. On the other hand, localized adaptations can strengthen. Fish that tolerate slightly lower oxygen levels may outcompete those that cannot. Invertebrates that anchor firmly in calmer sediment may thrive while others disappear. Isolation filters predators as well. Large pelagic hunters such as certain shark species prefer expansive open waters. Narrow entrances and shallow sills discourage frequent entry. In their absence, mid-sized predators dominate. That changes the structure of the food web. prey species experience different pressures. Growth rates shift. Behavior adjusts. In some remote bays, top predators are marine mammals that visit seasonally rather than year-round. A population of seals may haul out on undisturbed rocks. Their presence shapes fish distributions near the surface, but during months when they leave, fish may occupy areas previously avoided. This silence of distance extends beyond sound and species movement. It includes reduced chemical disturbance. Industrial contaminants travel through currents, but bays shielded by geography receive lower concentrations. That does not make them immune to global pollutants such as microplastics or atmospheric deposition, but exposure is often slower. Sediment cores from remote basins often show thinner layers of heavy metal accumulation compared to urban harbours. Organic compounds associated with shipping fuel appear in lower concentrations. These chemical signatures confirm what geography suggests. Reduced connectivity reduces input. However, isolation also means limited rescue. If a disease enters a closed population, it may spread rapidly without replenishment from outside. Coral diseases, fish parasites, and harmful algal blooms can persist longer in systems with low flushing rates. The same boundaries that protect can trap. Distance shapes behaviour in subtle ways. Species in remote bays may show less fear of humans simply because encounters are rare. In some Arctic inlets, seals remain curious rather than skittish. In tropical lagoons rarely visited, reef fish may approach divers more closely. Yet this apparent boldness can reverse quickly if human presence increases. Bird life reflects isolation clearly. Seabirds often establish nesting colonies on cliffs surrounding inaccessible bays. The absence of terrestrial predators makes these sites valuable. Over generations, colonies expand. Guano enriches nearby waters with nutrients. Plankton blooms intensify locally, feeding fish populations. A loop forms between land and sea. Plant communities along isolated shorelines differ as well. Without trampling from visitors or construction of piers, vegetation remains intact. Mangroves extend undisturbed in tropical bays. Salt marshes in temperate zones maintain complex root networks that stabilise sediment. These plants filter runoff, creating clearer water and enhancing nursery habitat for juvenile fish. Distance can also mean extreme conditions. In polar bays, ice cover may persist for months. Under that ice, light penetration is minimal. Phytoplankton survive in low concentrations. When spring arrives and ice fractures, sunlight triggers rapid growth. The burst of productivity supports zooplankton swarms. Fish feed intensively during this narrow window. In some Antarctic bays, thick ice shelves restrict water exchange almost entirely. Below the ice, temperatures remain stable near freezing. Unique invertebrates cling to rock walls. Sea spiders and soft corals grow slowly in dark, cold water. These organisms live at a pace defined by temperature and limited energy input. Tropical isolated bays display different rhythms. Rainfall may dominate seasonal cycles. During heavy rains, freshwater plumes spread across the surface. Salinity drops temporarily. Certain fish retreat deeper. Others take advantage of nutrient pulses delivered by rivers. If the entrance remains narrow, fresh water may linger longer than it would along open coasts. Distance affects reproduction timing. In systems with predictable seasonal cues, species synchronize spawning to maximize survival. In remote bays with less external disturbance, these patterns remain stable. In more connected systems, changing currents or temperature anomalies can disrupt timing. Researchers working in remote coastal regions often remark on how intact trophic structures appear compared to heavily fished areas. In some isolated fjords, large predatory fish remain abundant because access is limited. Their presence keeps smaller fish populations balanced. Algal overgrowth, common in degraded reefs, is less severe. Yet isolation is not the same as immunity. Climate change reaches even the most distant bays. Rising sea temperatures alter species composition. Coral bleaching events occur even in lagoons rarely visited. In polar regions, warming reduces ice cover duration, increasing light exposure and shifting productivity patterns. Distance also shapes human perception. A remote bay may seem untouched, but indigenous communities often maintain long-standing relationships with these waters. Seasonal fishing camps, small boats carved from local wood, and oral histories link people to place. From the outside, it appears cut off. From within, it is part of a lived landscape. Anthropologists studying such regions document detailed ecological knowledge passed through generations. Tides are memorized, fish movements tracked by subtle surface patterns, weather shifts predicted by cloud shapes against surrounding cliffs. Distance from urban centres does not imply absence of human awareness. Isolation influences evolutionary timescales as well. Over thousands of years, species confined within semi-enclosed systems can diverge from relatives elsewhere. Slight morphological changes accumulate. Genetic studies sometimes reveal distinct lineages within a single fjord or lagoon. Microbial life demonstrates this clearly. In low-oxygen basins, specialized bacteria metabolize sulfur or methane. These microbes form mats on sediment surfaces. Their activity influences nutrient cycling. Because water renewal is slow, chemical gradients remain stable, long enough for such communities to persist. Some isolated bays contain hydrothermal activity or cold seeps, where methane bubbles upward from sediment. In these spots, unique invertebrates gather, supported by chemosynthetic bacteria. While not common, these features underscore how geographic separation allows unusual conditions to develop and persist. Distance also reduces artificial light at night. In urban harbours, coastal waters glow from city lights. In remote bays, darkness remains nearly complete. Nocturnal species operate under natural lunar cycles. Sea turtles navigating by starlight encounter fewer disorienting signals. Plankton migrations respond primarily to moon phases rather than street lamps. Acoustic research in remote bays has revealed deal patterns of fish, chorusing rarely detectable near busy ports. At dusk, certain species emit low-frequency pulses to coordinate spawning. Without engine noise, these signals travel clearly within the confined basin. Isolation affects sediment stability. Without frequent anchoring or dredging, seafloor structures remain intact. Burrowing organisms such as clams and worms maintain complex tunnels. These bioturbation processes erode upper sediment layers, influencing nutrient release. In some regions, remote bays function as climate refugia. Cooler water trapped below sills may buffer species during regional heat waves. Conversely, limited mixing can trap warmer water, intensifying stress. The outcome depends on local geography. Scientists often treat these systems as natural experiments. By comparing isolated bays to more connected ones, they identify how exchange rates shape biodiversity and resilience. Patterns observed in one remote basin may illuminate processes occurring at larger scales. The silence of distance, then, is not emptiness. It is reduced interference. It is the slowing of inputs and outputs. It is the narrowing of pathways. Within those narrowed pathways, life rearranges itself according to available resources and constraints. As we continue along this line of thought, the image of a bay becomes less like a simple indentation in the coast and more like a contained world with its own internal dynamics. The farther it sits from regular movement of ships, currents, and large migrating populations, the more distinct those internal dynamics become. And in that distinction, in that separation maintained by cliffs, reefs, ice, or sheer remoteness, the organisms that remain learn to exist within defined limits, adapting not to constant influx, but to continuity shaped by the quiet persistence of distance. When a population is separated long enough, change begins to accumulate, not in sudden leaps, not in dramatic transformations that happen within a generation. It happens slowly, almost invisibly at first. Small differences in diet, slight shifts in water temperature, variations in predator presence. Over years, then centuries, then millennia, those small differences layer on top of each other. In isolated bays, where exchange with the wider ocean is restricted, that layering can shape organisms in ways that feel subtle up close but significant when compared side by side with their relatives elsewhere. Evolution in seclusion follows the same principles that operate everywhere else. Variation exists within a population. Some individuals are better suited to local conditions. They survive, reproduce, and pass on traits that fit the environment. The key difference in isolated systems is that outside genes arrive less frequently. The gene pool is narrower. Local pressures have a stronger influence. Take fish species that enter a semi-enclosed bay and remain there year-round because the entrance is narrow or shallow. If the bay has slightly lower oxygen levels in deeper water, individuals that tolerate mild hypoxia may forage more efficiently than those that require higher oxygen. Over time, selection favours traits linked to improved oxygen utilisation. Gill surface area may increase slightly. Hemoglobin binding properties may shift subtly. None of these changes are dramatic enough to notice without measurement, but they matter biologically. In colder isolated fjords, fish may develop slower growth rates compared to open ocean counterparts. Lower temperatures and limited prey availability reduce metabolic rates. Individuals that conserve energy effectively persist. Body size at maturity may differ. Spawning seasons may shift to align with brief pulses of productivity. In tropical lagoons cut off by reef barriers, reef fish populations sometimes display unique coloration patterns. These differences can arise from sexual selection within a limited community. If a particular colour variation becomes preferred by mates and remains confined within the bay, it can spread locally without mixing with external populations. Invertebrates provide even clearer examples. Sessile organisms such as barnacles, mussels, and corals are especially sensitive to water chemistry and flow patterns. In an isolated bay with calmer water, coral morphologies may favour broader plate-like forms to maximise light capture, rather than compact branching forms that resist strong currents. Over generations, colony structure reflects local hydrodynamics. Mollusks living in sediment-rich basins may develop thicker shells if predation pressure differs from that in open coastlines. Alternatively, in bays with fewer shell-crushing predators, shell thickness may decrease, reallocating energy toward reproduction instead of defense. Isolation can also reduce competition. If certain predator species rarely enter a bay due to shallow sills or narrow passages, prey species may occupy broader niches. Fish that would normally hide among rocks might forage more openly. Behavioural traits can shift in response to altered risk landscapes. Genetic drift plays a stronger role in small, isolated populations. Random fluctuations in gene frequency can lead to divergence even without strong selection pressure. Over long periods, these random shifts accumulate. When researchers analyse DNA from organisms in remote bays, they sometimes find genetic markers distinct from nearby coastal populations, despite apparent similarity in appearance. Microbial life evolves rapidly, and isolated chemical environments amplify that pace. In low-oxygen basins, bacteria that metabolize sulfur compounds may dominate. If those conditions persist, entire microbial communities specialize in pathways uncommon elsewhere. These microbes influence nutrient cycling, shaping higher trophic levels indirectly. In polar bays covered by seasonal ice, organisms adapt to prolonged darkness and low productivity. Certain amphipods and isopods grow slowly but live longer than relatives in warmer waters. Metabolic pathways adjust to conserve energy during extended winter periods. Marine mammals visiting isolated bays may develop localized behaviors. A small population of dolphins using a sheltered inlet as a feeding ground may refine hunting techniques specific to the bay's geography. Over time, these learned behaviors become part of cultural transmission within that group. Bird colonies nesting along cliffs of remote bays often display strong site fidelity. Generations return to the same ledges. If surrounding waters favour particular fish species, birds may specialise in capturing those prey, adjusting beak use and foraging strategies accordingly. Sometimes isolation creates dwarf or giant forms. In enclosed environments with limited resources, smaller body sizes may be favoured because they require less energy. In contrast, absence of predators can allow certain species to grow larger than usual. There are documented cases of landlocked marine species evolving from isolated bays that became cut off entirely due to tectonic uplift or sediment accumulation. Over thousands of years, salinity levels changed gradually. Marine fish populations adapted to brackish conditions. Eventually, some species tolerated near freshwater environments, diverging significantly from marine ancestors. In deep fjord basins with restricted circulation, low oxygen conditions can favour invertebrates capable of anaerobic metabolism. These species may display unique enzyme adaptations allowing survival where most others cannot persist. Seclusion also affects parasites and symbiotic relationships. In a closed system, host-parasite dynamics stabilise differently. If a parasite depends on multiple host species and one is absent, its life cycle may fail. Conversely, parasites that require only local hosts may thrive without interruption. Reproductive timing often becomes finely tuned to local conditions. In bays with predictable nutrient pulses from seasonal river inflow, spawning may coincide precisely with those pulses. In open systems, broader dispersal reduces the need for such precision. Behavioural isolation compounds genetic isolation. If fish populations remain within a bay and do not migrate outward, even when capable, gene flow decreases further. Barriers do not always need to be physical. Sometimes they are behavioural. Researchers studying sequestered marine systems use tagging and acoustic tracking to measure movement patterns. In some isolated bays, tagged fish remain within a few kilometres for years. In more open coasts, the same species might travel hundreds of kilometres. Over evolutionary timescales, even slight differences in salinity can shape physiology. Osmoregulation, the ability to maintain internal salt balance, becomes finely calibrated. Fish in brackish, isolated lagoons may differ in kidney function compared to fully marine populations. Some isolated bays contain hydrothermal vents or methane seeps, creating localized chemical gradients. Organisms inhabiting these niches adapt to high sulfide concentrations. Their enzymes and cellular structures reflect these constraints. Evolution in seclusion is not always progressive in the sense of increasing complexity. Sometimes traits are lost. If a predator never enters an enclosed basin, prey species may reduce defensive behaviours. Bright warning colours may fade if no predator recognises them. Such changes can make species vulnerable if conditions shift suddenly. Connectivity occasionally returns. A major storm might deepen a sandbar entrance. A tectonic shift might widen a channel. When previously isolated populations encounter external relatives again, hybridization can occur. The genetic signatures of long separation may blur. In some cases, however, isolation persists long enough to produce species-level divergence. Scientists classify endemic species based on such prolonged separation. Endemism is more common on islands, but semi-enclosed marine basins can generate similar patterns. Plankton communities reflect isolation clearly. Species composition in restricted bays often differs in relative abundance compared to surrounding waters. Smaller phytoplankton adapted to stable conditions may dominate over larger species requiring turbulent mixing. The physical structure of the bay influences evolutionary pathways. Steep rocky walls favour organisms that cling tightly. Muddy basins support burrowers. Coral-ringed lagoons favour reef specialists. Temperature stability is another factor. In deep isolated basins, temperature fluctuations may be minimal year-round. Species adapted to narrow temperature ranges can persist. In open coasts with frequent upwelling, temperature variability selects for broader tolerance. In some tropical isolated bays, freshwater springs emerge underwater. These create pockets of reduced salinity and altered chemistry. Organisms near these springs may evolve tolerance to fluctuating conditions. Even the absence of human noise can shape biology indirectly. Chronic noise pollution in busy ports affects fish stress hormones and reproductive success. In quiet, remote bays, stress levels remain lower, allowing natural behaviours to persist uninterrupted. Isolation also means limited introduction of invasive species. Many marine invasions occur via ship ballast water or hull fouling. Bays rarely visited by ships experience fewer such introductions. Native communities remain intact longer. However, when invasive species do arrive in isolated systems, impact can be severe. Without established competitors or predators adapted to them, newcomers may spread rapidly. The pace of evolutionary change depends on generation time. Microbes adapt within days, small invertebrates within years, larger fish over decades. In remote bays that have existed in relative isolation since the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago, sufficient time has passed for meaningful divergence in certain taxa. Genomic sequencing now reveals these differences with clarity. Slight variations in DNA sequences accumulate in isolated populations. Phylogenetic trees trace separation events back to climatic shifts or geological changes. Isolation can also protect ancient lineages. Some species persist in remote basins because they face less competition from newer, more aggressive species common elsewhere. These bays function as refuges for evolutionary holdovers. Over long spans of time, the biological community within an isolated bay becomes internally coherent. Species interactions stabilize around available resources and constraints. While dynamic, the system operates within defined boundaries shaped by geography. The idea of creatures evolving alone is not romantic. It is mechanical. It is driven by selection, drift, mutation, and time. But the outcome can feel remarkable when observed carefully. As we continue examining these secluded coastal worlds, it becomes clear that isolation is not a static condition. It is a process unfolding over thousands of years, quietly sculpting organisms to fit the narrow stage on which they live, adapting not to the vast openness of the ocean beyond, but to the contained and consistent conditions within the curve of their own enclosed sea. At the western edge of Greenland, where the land feels less like a coastline and more like a fracture between ice and sea, lies Disco Bay. On a map, it appears as a broad indentation along the island's west coast, opening toward Baffin Bay. In reality, it feels less like a bay in the conventional sense and more like a cold, breathing basin filled with drifting ice the size of apartment buildings. Isolation here is not subtle. It is not merely a matter of distance from cities or shipping lanes. It is written into the climate, into the seasonal freeze and thaw, into the immense glacier that feeds the bay with ice year after year. The nearest significant settlement, Ilulissat, is small by global standards. Beyond that, the landscape stretches into tundra and ice cap. Roads do not connect towns across Greenland. Travel happens by boat, by air, or not at all. If you imagine standing at the shoreline, you would not see gentle waves lapping at sand. You would see icebergs. Some lean at improbable angles. Some rotate slowly as their submerged mass shifts. Some crack without warning, sending sharp echoes across the water. The bay is rarely empty. It is occupied by floating ice that has broken free from one of the most productive glaciers in the Northern Hemisphere. That glacier, known as Ecological, drains a significant portion of the Greenland ice sheet. It calves continuously, releasing massive slabs of ice into the fjord system that feeds into Disco Bay. The result is a steady procession of icebergs moving outward, carried by currents and wind. These icebergs are not static scenery. They are dynamic structures, reshaping the surface of the bay, altering light penetration, and influencing water circulation. The presence of so much ice affects nearly every aspect of life here. During winter, Sea ice forms across large portions of the bay. Temperatures drop well below freezing. Daylight shortens dramatically. For months, the sun barely rises above the horizon. In that period, biological activity slows. Phytoplankton growth is limited by light. Fish movements become more constrained. Yet the isolation of winter does not equate to absence of life. Under the ice, small crustaceans continue to move. Arctic cod shelter in cold water layers. Seals surface through breathing holes, maintaining access points in the ice. The system shifts into a low-energy state, but it does not stop. When spring arrives, the transformation is rapid. Sunlight increases. Sea ice begins to fracture and drift apart. Meltwater from the glacier carries fine sediment into the bay, creating a milky turquoise colour near the fjord mouth. This sediment plume influences how light penetrates the water column, which in turn shapes where phytoplankton can grow most efficiently. The spring phytoplankton bloom in Arctic waters is often intense but brief. Nutrients accumulated during winter mixing become available when light returns. Plankton populations surge. Zooplankton feed on them. Fish follow. The food web accelerates within a compressed time frame. This productivity draws larger visitors. Humpback whales, minke whales, and occasionally fin whales enter the bay during ice-free months to feed. The sheltered waters offer rich feeding grounds. Schools of small fish and dense krill concentrations provide reliable resources. For whales, the isolation of Disco Bay can be advantageous. There is relatively low vessel traffic compared to more temperate feeding grounds. Acoustic interference is limited. The steep fjord walls reflect sound, creating complex acoustic environments, but not the continuous engine noise found in busy shipping corridors. Whale researchers working in the area have documented consistent seasonal return patterns. Individual humpbacks are identified by unique fluke markings. Some return year after year to feed in the same region. The bay becomes part of their migratory memory. Seals are year-round residents. Ringed seals maintain breathing holes through winter ice. Harp seals move through seasonally. Their presence supports higher predators such as polar bears, though polar bears are more commonly associated with northern pack ice than with the immediate vicinity of Disco Bay's open waters. The cold, stratified water of the bay influences fish distribution. Arctic cod, a key species in Arctic food webs, prefer cold, ice-associated habitats. Their abundance supports not only marine mammals but also seabirds. Cliffs surrounding parts of the bay host nesting colonies of kittiwakes and guillemots during summer. These birds feed on small fish near the surface. Guano from colonies contributes nutrients back into coastal waters, reinforcing localized productivity. Isolation here also operates through limited water exchange at depth. The fjord system feeding into Disco Bay includes sills that restrict deep water renewal. In some basins, bottom waters remain cold and relatively stable for extended periods. This stability favours certain benthic invertebrates adapted to near-freezing temperatures. Marine biologists studying benthic communities in Arctic fjords have found sponges, soft corals, and echinoderms thriving in these cold, stable conditions. Growth rates are slow, lifespans can be long. Disturbance is minimal compared to temperate coastal systems subject to heavy trawling. Human activity in Disco Bay is present but constrained. Ilulissat serves as a hub for tourism focused on viewing icebergs, and the nearby Ilulissat Ice Fjord, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Boats carry visitors close to towering ice formations. Yet beyond the immediate vicinity of town, traffic remains sparse. Fishing does occur, particularly for species such as Greenland halibut and shrimp. However, harsh weather, ice conditions, and limited infrastructure cap the scale of operations. Industrial-scale development is challenging in such an environment. Climate change has introduced new variables. The Greenland ice sheet is losing mass at an accelerating rate. Increased glacial melt alters freshwater input into the bay. Changes in freshwater influence stratification, nutrient distribution, and potentially the timing of phytoplankton blooms. Reduced sea ice duration extends the open water season. This may benefit certain species, including whales, by lengthening feeding windows. It may also alter predator-prey dynamics. Species more typical of subarctic waters could gradually extend their range northward. Oceanographers measure temperature and salinity profiles to track these shifts. Long-term monitoring indicates warming trends in some West Greenland coastal waters. Even small temperature increases in Arctic systems can have outsized ecological effects. Isolation in Disco Bay has historically limited invasive species introduction. Few ships arrive from distant ports. Ballast water discharge is minimal compared to major harbours. Native Arctic species dominate. However, increased accessibility due to reduced ice cover could change that dynamic. As Arctic shipping routes expand, traffic through nearby waters may rise. With that rise comes the risk of introducing non-native species or pollutants. Despite these changes, the fundamental geographic isolation remains strong. Surrounding terrain is rugged. Population density is low. Infrastructure development is slow due to cost and environmental constraints. Standing on a rocky outcrop above the bay in late summer, one might see icebergs drifting outward, whales surfacing briefly, seabirds circling, and a wide expanse of cold water stretching toward the horizon. The scale feels large, yet the community of organisms within it is tightly connected. Isolation here is reinforced by climate, by ice, by limited human presence, and by the physical structure of fjords feeding into the basin. It creates a system where seasonal pulses dominate, where energy flows are intense but concentrated, where life is adapted to extremes of light and temperature. The bay is not silent in a literal sense. Ice cracks, whales exhale in sudden bursts, wind moves across open water. But compared to most coastal regions on Earth, the absence of constant mechanical noise and dense human traffic is striking. Over thousands of years since the last glacial retreat, species have adjusted to these conditions. Genetic studies of Arctic marine populations reveal patterns shaped by repeated cycles of ice expansion and contraction. Disco Bay has been alternately more open and more enclosed depending on climatic phases. Today it functions as both a feeding ground and a transit corridor for Arctic marine life. It is isolated yet not entirely closed. Currents connect it to Baffin Bay. Migratory species link it to distant oceans. That combination of connection and constraint defines its character. It is shaped by forces far beyond its shoreline, including global climate systems, yet its daily rhythms are governed by local ice, light, and depth. And as we move from the cold, ice-laden waters of Greenland toward warmer regions of the world, the idea of isolation shifts from glacial barriers to other kinds of boundaries, where ancient marine life persists not under ice, but within shallow, sunlit basins shaped by entirely different histories. On the western edge of Australia, far from the dense urban stretch of the continent's southeast, lies Shark Bay. At first glance, it appears wide open. Unlike the steep Arctic fjords of Greenland, there are no towering ice cliffs or glaciers feeding into its waters. The horizon looks expansive, the sky feels immense. Yet despite that openness, this bay functions as one of the most naturally isolated marine systems on Earth. Isolation here is not defined by cold or ice. It is defined by structure and salinity. Shark Bay is partially enclosed by long peninsulas and islands that limit water exchange with the Indian Ocean. Within that enclosure, shallow banks and seagrass meadows further divide the bay into separate basins. Some of those basins have water chemistry so distinct that species inside them experience conditions unlike the surrounding ocean. One of the most remarkable features of Shark Bay is its hypersalinity. In certain regions, evaporation rates exceed freshwater input. Rainfall is low. River inflow is minimal. Water trapped within shallow basins becomes saltier than the open sea. In places such as Hamelin Pool, salinity levels can reach nearly twice that of normal seawater. Most marine organisms cannot tolerate such elevated salinity. Fish diversity declines sharply in these hypersaline zones. Predators that would normally graze, crush, or consume smaller organisms struggle to survive. That absence of grazers creates an opportunity for something unusual to persist. In Hamelin Pool, within Shark Bay, live structures that resemble knobby rock formations rising from shallow water. They are not rocks, they are stromatolites. These layered microbial communities are formed by cyanobacteria trapping and binding sediment. Over time, layer upon layer accumulates, creating domed or column-like shapes. Stromatolites are not new inventions of modern ecology. They are among the oldest known life forms on Earth. Fossilized stromatolites date back more than 3 billion years. Long before plants covered land, before animals swam in oceans, microbial mats like these were shaping Earth's atmosphere by releasing oxygen as a byproduct of photosynthesis. In most marine environments today, stromatolites are rare because grazing animals consume the microbial mats before they can build significant structures. In Shark Bay's hypersaline pockets, however, the lack of grazers allows them to persist and grow. The isolation created by high salinity protects a biological form that dominated the planet billions of years ago. Standing knee-deep in the shallow water near these formations, one might see them emerging just below the surface, textured and irregular. They are living communities. Each millimetre of growth represents years of microbial activity. The process is slow. The scale is patient. Shark Bay is also home to vast seagrass meadows, some of the largest and most diverse in the world. These meadows occupy shallow areas where light penetrates easily. Seagrasses stabilize sediment, reduce wave energy, and provide habitat for countless invertebrates and juvenile fish. Seagrass density in Shark Bay contributes further to isolation within the bay. Thick meadows act almost like underwater forests, slowing water movement and creating microhabitats. Nutrients cycle locally. Carbon is stored in sediment below. Dugongs feed extensively on these seagrass beds. Shark Bay supports one of the world's largest populations of dugongs. These large marine mammals graze slowly, uprooting seagrass with broad muzzles. Their feeding behaviour shapes meadow composition. Areas heavily grazed may shift species dominance over time. Bottlenose dolphins are also long-term residents. Research in Shark Bay has documented culturally transmitted behaviours among dolphin populations, including the use of marine sponges as tools to protect their rostrums while foraging on the seafloor. This behaviour is not universal among dolphins worldwide. It is localised and passed down through generations within this community. Such behavioural specialisation reflects both ecological opportunity and relative isolation. When populations remain within defined geographic limits, learned behaviours can persist without being diluted by incoming groups. Shark Bay's partial enclosure by landforms reduces strong oceanic currents from penetrating deeply into its interior basins. The foresail and other shallow banks restrict deeper water flow. As a result, water exchange with the Indian Ocean is slower than in open coastlines. Temperature fluctuations in shallow regions can be pronounced. In summer, water warms significantly. Organisms must tolerate these swings. Seagrasses here exhibit resilience to heat stress that is now of interest to scientists studying climate adaptation. Isolation in Shark Bay also functions on evolutionary timescales. Genetic studies of certain fish and invertebrates reveal distinct lineages compared to nearby coastal populations. While not entirely cut off, reduced exchange fosters divergence. Seabird colonies nest on islands within the bay. These islands, protected from terrestrial predators by surrounding water, provide safe breeding grounds. Guano enriches adjacent waters, influencing nutrient dynamics locally. Human presence exists but remains limited by geography and remoteness. The nearest major city, Perth, lies several hundred kilometres to the south. Access requires long drives across sparsely populated landscapes. Tourism is present, particularly for wildlife viewing, but infrastructure remains relatively low density. Shark Bay is recognised as a UNESCO World Heritage Site due to its ecological significance. That designation reflects both the ancient biological features and the contemporary biodiversity supported by its seagrass systems. Commercial fishing occurs but is regulated. The bay supports fisheries for species such as snapper and prawns. Management strategies aim to prevent overexploitation, recognising the sensitivity of semi-enclosed systems. The hypersaline zones remain particularly delicate. Minor changes in water flow could alter salinity balance, potentially affecting stromatolite survival. Monitoring efforts track water chemistry closely. Unlike the stark, cold isolation of Arctic bays, Shark Bay's seclusion feels warm and bright. The sky stretches wide. The water in shallow areas glows turquoise over pale sand. Yet beneath that calm surface lies a system structured by barriers both visible and invisible. Evaporation rates are a critical driver here. Western Australia's arid climate means rainfall contributes little dilution. Wind patterns influence surface mixing but do not overcome structural barriers created by peninsulas and banks. In certain inner basins, tidal exchange is limited to narrow channels. During low tides, water levels drop noticeably. Organisms must withstand periodic exposure or fluctuating salinity. Shark Bay also contains marine embayments, where mangroves fringe the shoreline. These mangroves provide nursery habitat for fish and crustaceans. Their roots trap sediment and further slow water movement. Climate variability affects the system. Marine heat waves have impacted seagrass meadows in recent years. Some areas experience significant die-off during extreme warming events. Recovery depends on seed dispersal and local resilience, yet the persistence of stromatolites demonstrates long-term stability within specific pockets. These microbial structures have survived for thousands of years in Shark Bay's unique conditions. Their presence provides a tangible link to Earth's distant biological past. Isolation here has preserved not only species but processes. The slow layering of microbial mats, the steady grazing patterns of dugongs, the culturally transmitted hunting strategies of dolphins. These processes unfold within boundaries shaped by geology and climate. Water clarity in certain regions allows sunlight to reach the seabed easily. In others, suspended sediment reduces visibility. These differences create patchwork habitats across the bay. Shark Bay's name derives from early European explorers who observed numerous sharks in its waters. Several species inhabit the area, including tiger sharks. Their presence influences prey behaviour. Dugongs and turtles adjust grazing patterns in response to shark density. Predator-prey dynamics in this relatively contained system have been studied extensively. The bay serves as a model for understanding how large predators shape ecosystem structure in semi-enclosed environments. Over millennia, sea levels have risen and fallen, altering the bay's configuration. During glacial periods, lower sea levels exposed large portions of the seabed. As seas rose, current peninsulas and banks formed barriers that enhanced enclosure. Today, the combination of shallow banks, hypersaline basins, extensive seagrass meadows, and limited freshwater inflow defines Shark Bay's character. It is not entirely cut off from the Indian Ocean, but it is distinct enough to foster biological features rarely found elsewhere. Isolation in this case is not dramatic in appearance. There are no walls of ice, no towering cliffs enclosing a narrow channel. Instead, the isolation is subtle. It exists in water chemistry, in current speed, in salinity gradients, and in the persistence of ancient microbial communities. The bay holds living fossils not in the sense of unchanged organisms frozen in time, but in the sense of ancient biological strategies still operating in a modern world. Stromatolites continue building layered structures as they did billions of years ago, protected by environmental constraints that limit their competitors. As we continue exploring remote bays across the globe, it becomes clear that isolation takes many forms. In some places it is enforced by cold and ice, in others by salinity and shallow banks. In each case, geography sets the stage, and life responds according to the boundaries drawn around it, adapting quietly within contained waters that, though connected to the greater ocean, function according to their own internal rules. When most people hear the name Chesapeake Bay, they do not imagine isolation. They imagine sailboats, fishing piers, waterfront towns with wooden docks and crab traps stacked neatly beside them. They imagine bridges crossing broad water and summer evenings scented faintly with salt and marsh grass. On the surface, this bay feels familiar, accessible, and woven tightly into the fabric of daily life along the eastern United States. And yet, beneath that familiarity lies a form of isolation that is not obvious at first glance. It is not the isolation of distance from people. It is not guarded by ice or remote peninsulas that deter travel. Instead, it is ecological isolation shaped by depth, salinity gradients, stratified water layers, and the sheer size of the watershed that feeds into it. It is a bay whose inner workings are far more complex than its postcard image suggests. Chesapeake Bay is the largest estuary in the United States. It stretches over 300 kilometers from the Susquehanna River in the north down to its opening into the Atlantic Ocean. More than 150 rivers and streams drain into it. This immense watershed covers parts of 6 states and the District of Columbia. Rain falling hundreds of kilometers inland eventually finds its way into this single body of water. With so much fresh water pouring in, the bay is not uniform. Its northern reaches are far less salty than its southern opening. Salinity forms a gradient, increasing gradually from top to bottom. This gradient creates zones. Species that thrive in brackish water dominate certain areas. Others require higher salinity and remain closer to the ocean mouth. At the same time, the bay is relatively shallow. Its average depth is around 6 to 7 meters, though deeper channels cut through parts of it. Those channels, carved by ancient river systems before sea levels rose, act like submerged corridors. They hold cooler, saltier water that creeps inward beneath lighter, fresh water at the surface. This vertical layering, called stratification, is key to understanding the bay's hidden isolation. In summer, warm fresh water sits atop cooler, saltier water. The two layers mix poorly because of their density difference. Oxygen from the atmosphere dissolves readily into surface water, but it does not easily reach deeper layers. As organic material sinks and decomposes in those deeper layers, bacteria consume oxygen. Without sufficient mixing, oxygen levels drop. In certain regions and seasons, bottom waters become hypoxic, meaning oxygen is too low to support many forms of marine life. Fish and crabs must move to avoid these zones. Sessile organisms cannot. This creates pockets of isolation within a bay that is otherwise busy with boats and shoreline communities. Beneath the surface, in deeper channels during summer months, there are areas where life thins dramatically. These hypoxic zones are not visible from above. A sailboat gliding over them would detect nothing unusual. The causes of these seasonal oxygen shortages are tied to nutrient inputs from the watershed. Agricultural runoff, urban stormwater, and wastewater treatment plants deliver nitrogen and phosphorus into rivers that feed the bay. These nutrients fuel phytoplankton growth. When phytoplankton die, they sink and decompose, drawing oxygen from bottom waters. In effect, Chesapeake Bay is partially isolated by its own stratification. Surface waters teem with activity while deeper layers become chemically distinct. The two worlds overlap spatially but differ biologically. Despite this, the bay supports remarkable biodiversity. Blue crabs are perhaps its most iconic species. These crustaceans move between salinity zones during different life stages. Females migrate towards saltier southern waters to spawn. Larvae drift toward the ocean, before returning as juveniles to grow in brackish nursery habitats. Eastern oysters once formed extensive reefs throughout the bay. These reefs were not merely food sources for humans. They filtered water continuously, removing particles and improving clarity. Oysters create three-dimensional habitat structures that support fish and invertebrates. Overharvesting and disease drastically reduced oyster populations during the 20th century. With fewer oysters filtering water, clarity declined. Seagrass meadows shrank. This loss amplified nutrient-related problems, illustrating how interconnected the system is. Striped bass, also known as rockfish in the region, move seasonally through the bay. They spawn in freshwater tributaries and migrate toward the ocean as they mature. Their life cycle depends on the estuarine gradient. Seagrass meadows, particularly eelgrass and widgeon grass, anchor shallow areas where light penetrates to the bottom. These meadows stabilize sediment and provide habitat for juvenile fish and crabs. When water clarity declines due to nutrient over-enrichment, seagrasses suffer. The isolation within Chesapeake Bay is therefore dynamic and seasonal rather than fixed. In winter, colder temperatures and stronger winds increase mixing. Oxygen reaches deeper waters more effectively. Hypoxic zones shrink. In summer, stratification strengthens. Isolation of bottom layers intensifies. Human presence along the shoreline is extensive. Major cities including Baltimore and Norfolk sit along its edges. The Chesapeake Bay Bridge spans wide stretches of water. Cargo ships transit its channels. Fishing boats harvest crabs and fish daily. Yet even with this activity, the bay's internal processes operate according to physical principles that are not easily altered by surface impressions. The deep channel running along its axis acts as a conveyor for saltwater intrusion from the Atlantic. Meanwhile, fresh water continues pouring from upstream rivers. This two-layer circulation pattern creates a subtle isolation between upper and lower water masses. It also shapes how pollutants and nutrients move. Some are flushed toward the ocean, others settle and linger. Sediment cores extracted from the bay floor reveal layers corresponding to centuries of change. Pollen grains indicate shifts in surrounding forest composition. Industrial-era sediments contain traces of heavy metals. Oyster shell fragments record past abundance levels. Indigenous peoples lived along the bay for thousands of years before European arrival. They harvested oysters and fish sustainably within natural limits. European colonization brought intensified agriculture, deforestation, and expanded settlement. Nutrient inputs increased gradually. By the mid-20th century, signs of ecological stress became evident. Declines in oyster populations and periodic fish kills drew attention to water quality issues. Large-scale restoration efforts began, focusing on nutrient reduction, wetland restoration, and oyster reef rebuilding. Wetlands fringing the bay function as buffers. They absorb nutrients and filter runoff before it reaches open water. However, development has reduced wetland area significantly. Loss of these natural filters increases nutrient delivery into the bay. Despite these pressures, Chesapeake Bay remains resilient in many respects. Tidal marshes support diverse bird populations. Bald eagles, once severely reduced due to pesticide exposure, have rebounded along its shores. Osprey nests dot channel markers and pilings. Isolation within the bay also manifests in smaller tributaries. Narrow creeks winding through marshland can become semi-enclosed systems of their own. Salinity levels shift rapidly with tides. Fish species composition changes over short distances. Acoustic environments vary as well. In busy shipping lanes near Baltimore, underwater noise levels are high. In remote marsh creeks, natural sounds dominate. Snapping shrimp and fish choruses fill the water column at dusk. Researchers deploy autonomous sensors to track dissolved oxygen, temperature, and salinity continuously. Data reveals daily fluctuations linked to tidal cycles. It also shows how quickly conditions can change after heavy rainfall events upstream. Climate change introduces additional complexity. Rising sea levels push salt water farther upstream. Warmer temperatures intensify stratification. Extreme rainfall events increase nutrient runoff. Restoration strategies must adapt to these shifting baselines. The bay's familiarity can obscure its fragility. It feels integrated into daily life. People kayak, fish, and sail across its waters. Yet beneath those activities lies a system finely balanced between freshwater inflow and ocean exchange. Unlike remote Arctic or Australian bays, Chesapeake Bay is not geographically distant from human activity. Its isolation is internal. It exists in chemical gradients, in seasonal layering, in zones where oxygen disappears and returns with changing weather. This form of isolation is instructive because it demonstrates that separation does not always require remoteness. A bay can sit beside major cities and still harbour hidden environments shaped by physics and biology operating below sight lines. Standing on a pier at sunset watching the water reflect orange light, one might see only surface ripples. Beneath that surface, a vertical boundary may separate oxygen-rich water from oxygen-poor depths only a few metres below. Fish schools hover carefully above that boundary, avoiding deeper layers. Over decades, management efforts have reduced nutrient input somewhat. Oyster reef restoration projects aim to rebuild filtration capacity. Seagrass acreage has shown signs of recovery in certain regions following improvements in water clarity. These incremental changes illustrate how human intervention can influence even large estuarine systems. Chesapeake Bay is a working landscape, not a distant wilderness. Its isolation patterns are shaped by human decisions as much as by geology. As we continue exploring isolated bays around the world, Chesapeake Bay reminds us that isolation is not always about emptiness or absence. It can exist within populated coastlines, hidden in the vertical structure of water columns, and in the complex interactions between rivers and sea. The bay's familiar shores conceal layered environments that shift with seasons and tides. Its depths, though not dramatic in scale compared to glacial fjords, contain zones of separation as real as any Arctic ice barrier. And as we move onward to other enclosed waters across the globe, the concept of isolation expands further, taking new forms in landscapes shaped by entirely different forces. On the southwestern edge of New Zealand's South Island, where steep mountains plunge directly into dark water, lies Milford Sound. Despite its name, it is not technically a sound. It is a fjord, carved by glaciers during the last ice age, later flooded by the sea when the ice retreated. The distinction matters geologically, though standing at the shoreline, what you feel first is not classification. It is scale. The cliffs rise almost vertically from the water. In some places they climb more than 1,000 metres without a gradual slope. Rain falls frequently here, and when it does, temporary waterfalls appear along rock faces that were dry only hours before. Clouds cling to peaks. Fog drifts low across the surface. The air carries moisture nearly all the time. Isolation in Milford Sound is defined by terrain and depth. Access is limited by steep mountains and winding roads that cross alpine passes. There is one main road leading in and out. Weather can close it. Landslides are not uncommon. The fjord itself extends inland roughly 15 kilometres from the Tasman Sea, narrowing as it moves deeper between towering walls of rock. Below the surface, the fjord drops sharply. Depths exceed 400 metres in some areas. Near the entrance lies a shallow sill, a submerged ridge left behind by glacial processes. This sill restricts the flow of deep ocean water into the fjord's interior. As a result, the water column becomes layered. Heavy rainfall is one of the defining features of fjordland. Annual precipitation can exceed 6 metres. Fresh water from countless small streams pours down cliffs and into the fjord. That fresh water forms a tannin-rich surface layer only a few metres thick. Because it is less dense than seawater, it floats on top. This creates a striking stratification. On the surface, dark tea-coloured fresh water flows outward toward the sea. Beneath it, cold, clearer salt water remains relatively isolated. Light penetration into the saltwater layer is reduced because the fresh water above absorbs and scatters much of it. That reduced light has profound ecological consequences. Species typically found at greater ocean depths can survive here at much shallower levels. Black corals, which elsewhere might inhabit deep, dim waters, attach themselves to rock faces only 10 to 20 metres below the surface. Divers descending through the freshwater layer describe a sudden shift. visibility changes, temperature drops slightly. The underwater world transitions from murky brown tones to clearer blue-grey. Vertical rock walls continue downward, covered in sponges, corals and sea stars. The fjord's vertical structure extends from mountain peak to deep basin floor. On land, vegetation clings to steep slopes. Temperate rainforest thrives in constant moisture. Mosses, ferns and trees root themselves in thin soil layers. Above that, alpine zones rise toward exposed ridgelines. The physical confinement of the fjord influences weather patterns locally. Mountains block prevailing winds. Clouds condense against high peaks. Rain falls intensely but unevenly. Fog often settles low, reducing visibility and muting sound. Marine mammals enter the fjord occasionally. Bottlenose dolphins are resident year-round. A small population has adapted to these waters. Their movements remain largely within the fjord system, rather than extending far into the open Tasman Sea. New Zealand fur seals haul out on rocky ledges near the entrance and within the fjord. They forage in surrounding waters but use the sheltered environment for rest and breeding. Occasionally, larger whales pass through, though they are less common visitors. The isolation created by the fjord's narrow entrance and steep walls reduces wave energy inside. Storm swells from the Tasman Sea diminish as they pass the sill, and wind around bends in the channel. The interior waters remain comparatively calm even when offshore conditions are rough. This calmness allows fine sediment to settle in deeper basins. Organic material sinking from above accumulates slowly. Because deep water renewal is limited by the sill, oxygen levels at the bottom can decline, though not typically to the extent seen in heavily nutrient-enriched estuaries. Milford Sound sits within Fiordland National Park, one of the largest protected areas in New Zealand. Human settlement inside the fjord itself is minimal. There are no large towns along its shores. A small village near the head of the fjord supports tourism operations, but permanent population is tiny. Tour boats travel daily along the length of the fjord. Kayakers paddle near cliffs. Helicopters occasionally fly overhead. Yet compared to most coastal regions globally, traffic remains light. The sheer difficulty of reaching the area keeps numbers manageable. Isolation here is reinforced not by absence of visitors, but by the overwhelming dominance of landscape. The mountains dictate movement. The water channel dictates navigation. There is little flat land to build upon. Infrastructure is constrained. The fjord's origins in glacial carving are visible in its shape. U-shaped valleys, steep walls, and hanging tributary valleys all testify to ice that once filled the space entirely. When glaciers retreated approximately 10,000 to 15,000 years ago, seawater flooded in. Since then, the fjord has existed as a semi-enclosed basin connected to the ocean, but shaped primarily by its internal dynamics. Freshwater input from rainfall continues to influence stratification. Seasonal variations in rainfall alter the thickness of the surface layer. Marine biologists studying the fjord note that species composition differs from adjacent open coastlines. The reduced light and stable deep water conditions favour organisms adapted to dim environments. Sessile invertebrates attach to vertical rock faces where sediment accumulation is minimal. The steepness of the walls creates a kind of underwater canyon system. Instead of broad sandy seabeds, there are narrow ledges and drop-offs. Fish species adjust accordingly. Rock-dwelling species dominate over those preferring open sandy flats. Sound behaves differently within the fjord. The enclosing walls reflect acoustic waves. Boat engines echo. Marine mammal vocalizations bounce back quickly. The acoustic environment is complex but contained. Rainfall-driven freshwater input carries organic material from surrounding forests into the fjord. Leaves, soil particles, and dissolved organic carbon enter via countless small streams. This input influences nutrient cycles and light attenuation. On land, bird life flourishes in relative isolation. The kea, a mountain parrot known for intelligence and curiosity, inhabits alpine areas nearby. Takahe and other endemic species persist within the broader fjordland region. Geologic stability is not guaranteed. The region lies along tectonic boundaries. Earthquakes occur, landslides can reshape slopes. The vertical wilderness is dynamic, even if it appears timeless. Milford Sound's remoteness is partly cultural. It holds significance in Maori tradition, known as Pio Pio Tahi. Oral histories describe the shaping of these landscapes long before European explorers arrived. European explorers who first navigated the fjord by ship were struck by its narrow entrance, which is difficult to spot from the open sea. High cliffs conceal the opening until vessels are nearly upon it. This subtle entrance enhances the sense of seclusion. Climate change poses questions for the fjord's future. Increased rainfall intensity or altered storm patterns could affect freshwater layering. Warming ocean temperatures might shift species distributions. Changes in glacial melt from remaining alpine glaciers in the region could alter sediment input. Despite these potential changes, the fundamental structure remains imposing. The mountains are not easily moved. The sill at the entrance continues to regulate deep water exchange. The vertical orientation of habitat from rainforest canopy to deep basin persists. Isolation in Milford Sound feels vertical as much as horizontal. The boundary between land and sea is abrupt. There is no gentle shoreline. Instead, rock descends straight into water, and water reflects straight up into rock. Standing on the deck of a boat moving slowly through the fjord, you might notice how small the vessel feels compared to the cliffs. Waterfalls appear and vanish with rainfall patterns. The sky shifts from blue to grey within minutes. Beneath that surface drama lies a layered marine system structured by fresh water, depth, and limited circulation. It is not isolated from the Tasman Sea entirely, but its internal conditions are distinct enough to support communities, uncommon in more open coastal waters. As we move onward to other remote bays around the world, the pattern continues to evolve. In some places, isolation is horizontal, enforced by distance across vast oceans. In others, like this fjord, it is vertical and geological, shaped by ice long gone but still evident in every contour of rock and water that defines the enclosed space within. Along the northeastern coast of Vietnam, where the Gulf of Tonkin presses gently against a fractured shoreline, lies Halong Bay. From above, it looks almost unreal. Thousands of limestone towers rise abruptly from green water. Some are tall and narrow like pillars, others are broader, capped with thick vegetation clinging to steep rock. Between them, narrow channels weave like a maze. At first glance, Halong Bay does not appear isolated in the traditional sense. It is well known. It draws visitors from around the world. Boats move steadily between its cast islands. Yet when you look more closely, isolation here exists at a finer scale. It is woven into the structure of the limestone labyrinth itself. Each cast tower functions like a vertical island. Many are separated from neighbouring formations by only a few dozen metres of water. Some enclose hidden lagoons accessible only through low caves that open at specific tide levels. Within those enclosed lagoons, water exchange is restricted. Species that enter may remain there for long periods. The geology of Halong Bay explains much of its character. The limestone formations began forming hundreds of millions of years ago, when the region lay beneath shallow seas. Over immense spans of time, tectonic uplift raised the limestone above water. Rainfall, slightly acidic due to dissolved carbon dioxide, slowly dissolved the rock. This process, known as karstification, sculpted towers, caves and sinkholes. When sea levels rose after the last glacial maximum, roughly 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, water flooded the lower valleys between karst hills. What had once been a landscape of peaks and valleys became an archipelago of steep-sided islands. The flooding created countless narrow inlets and enclosed basins. The result is a coastal system fragmented into micro-environments. Some channels are broad and open to tides, others are constricted. Certain lagoons, locally known as tung or ang, are nearly landlocked. A small cave at water level may connect them to the outside. During high tide, water flows in. During low tide, exchange slows dramatically. Within these partially enclosed lagoons, conditions differ subtly from surrounding waters. Salinity may fluctuate depending on rainfall. Temperature can vary slightly due to limited mixing. Sediment may settle more easily in calm water. Mangroves grow along the base of some limestone formations, especially in sheltered coves. Their roots stabilise sediment and provide habitat for juvenile fish and crustaceans. In more exposed channels, coral communities establish themselves on submerged rock faces. Because the bay is relatively shallow in many areas, light penetrates easily. Coral reefs thrive in pockets where water clarity remains high. However, heavy boat traffic and coastal development have introduced pressures. Sediment from mainland construction projects can reduce clarity in certain zones. Still, within the labyrinth of limestone towers, there are areas where isolation persists. Floating fishing villages once dotted parts of the bay, built on wooden platforms anchored in calm water between casts. Families live directly on the water, harvesting fish and shellfish from surrounding areas. Although many of these villages have been relocated in recent years for conservation and management reasons, their historical presence reflects how enclosed waters provided shelter from storms. Sound behaves unpredictably here. Voices echo off rock walls. Engine noise ricochets through narrow passages. In quieter corners, away from main tourist routes, the water becomes still enough that even small movements produce noticeable ripples against limestone. Caves cut into the karst formations reveal further layers of isolation. Some caves open high above the current waterline, indicating past sea levels. Others sit at present-day tide height, allowing kayaks or small boats to enter when conditions permit. Inside, stalactites hang from ceilings, formed by slow mineral deposition from dripping water over thousands of years. Certain cave systems contain internal lagoons entirely enclosed by rock except for a submerged tunnel connection. These lagoons are calm, protected from wind and waves. Water exchange occurs through narrow channels that restrict flow. Marine life within such lagoons may differ slightly from that outside. Smaller fish species dominate. Invertebrates cling to submerged rock surfaces. The limited area reduces predator diversity. Food webs remain compact. Halong Bay's biodiversity extends beyond marine systems. Vegetation atop limestone towers grows in thin soil pockets. Shrubs and small trees anchor themselves in crevices. Some plant species are endemic to the region, adapted to nutrient-poor substrates and high exposure to wind. Bird species nest on inaccessible ledges. Swallows and swiftlets dart between formations. Raptors occasionally circle above. The vertical terrain provides refuge from terrestrial predators. The tidal range in the Gulf of Tonkin influences water movement through the bay. During incoming tides, water flows through narrow channels between karsts, flushing some lagoons. During outgoing tides, currents reverse. However, the complexity of the topography dampens strong flow in many interior pockets. Water temperature in Halong Bay follows seasonal monsoon patterns. Summers are warm and humid, winters are cooler and drier. These seasonal shifts influence plankton communities and fish spawning cycles. Fisheries have long relied on the bay's productivity. Historically, small-scale fishing dominated. Nets were set between casts. Shellfish were harvested from rocky shallows. Over time, increased demand placed pressure on certain species. Tourism now represents a major economic driver. Cruise boats, kayaks, and day tours navigate established routes. While this brings economic benefits, it also introduces environmental challenges, including waste management and fuel emissions. Conservation efforts aim to balance access with protection. Marine protected zones restrict certain activities. Monitoring programs track coral health and water quality. Education initiatives promote sustainable practices among visitors and local communities. Isolation within Halong Bay is therefore layered. It is not a remote wilderness devoid of people. It is a complex mosaic of semi-enclosed habitats nested within a larger connected system. Consider a small lagoon enclosed by limestone walls on 3 sides and accessible only through a low cave passage. At high tide, seawater flows in, carrying plankton and small fish larvae. At low tide, exchange slows. Predators from the broader bay may not enter easily. Over time, species composition inside that lagoon stabilizes according to these constraints. Some lagoons host populations of jellyfish that thrive in nutrient-rich calm water. Others contain seagrass patches that anchor sediment in shallow areas. Crabs scuttle along rock faces. Snails graze on algae. The labyrinth structure also influences sediment deposition. Fine particles carried by rivers from mainland Vietnam settle in calmer interior zones. Over centuries, sediment layers build slowly in enclosed basins. Archaeological evidence suggests that humans have inhabited or used parts of the bay for thousands of years. Shell middens found in caves indicate long-standing reliance on marine resources. Even so, the physical fragmentation of the landscape limited large-scale development historically. Karst landscapes are inherently fragile. Limestone dissolves slowly under acidic conditions. Increased pollution can accelerate erosion. Boat anchors scraping reef surfaces cause localized damage. Water chemistry in enclosed lagoons can be sensitive to small disturbances. Nutrient input from a single source may have amplified effects compared to more open waters where dilution is rapid. Halong Bay's beauty often draws attention to its surface appearance, but its submerged topography is equally intricate. Underwater, limestone slopes descend steeply. Crevices provide shelter for fish. Soft corals wave gently in currents moving through narrow channels. Acoustic research in complex coastal systems shows that enclosed rocky environments create varied sound fields. Reflections and refractions alter how marine animals perceive their surroundings. Fish relying on acoustic cues for spawning or territory establishment may adapt behaviours accordingly. The interplay between freshwater runoff and seawater exchange shapes nutrient dynamics. During heavy rains, runoff from surrounding hills can introduce pulses of sediment and organic material. In enclosed lagoons, that material may linger longer. Halong Bay's relative proximity to populated mainland areas means it cannot be considered isolated in the way Arctic fjords are. Yet within its intricate geography exist dozens, perhaps hundreds, of microhabitats that function semi-independently for stretches of time. These microhabitats demonstrate that isolation does not always require vast distance. It can arise from physical barriers only meters thick, a cave ceiling separating lagoon from open water, a narrow rock corridor filtering tidal flow. Within those boundaries, life adapts to slightly altered salinity, temperature and predator presence. Behavioural patterns shift subtly. Juvenile fish may spend early life stages in calm interior waters before venturing outward. The bay's geological past remains visible everywhere. Every limestone pillar represents millions of years of deposition and erosion. Every cave records changes in sea level. The flooding that created today's seascape transformed terrestrial valleys into marine channels. Isolation here is dynamic. Tides connect and disconnect spaces twice daily. Seasonal rains alter chemistry. Human presence fluctuates with tourism cycles. Standing on a boat deck at dawn, watching mist curl around limestone towers, one might feel surrounded and enclosed at the same time. The open sea lies beyond the outer casts, yet inside the labyrinth, water pathways twist unpredictably. As we continue our exploration of the world's most isolated bays, Halong Bay adds another dimension. Isolation can be fractured, distributed, and compartmentalized within a larger network. It can exist not as a single boundary, but as a pattern repeated across hundreds of small enclosures carved by geology and shaped by water over thousands of years. From Arctic ice fields to Australian hypersaline basins to temperate estuaries, and now tropical limestone mazes, the theme remains consistent. Geography sets limits. Within those limits, life arranges itself according to available space, chemistry, and connection. And beyond each narrow passage or rock-lined corridor, another enclosed world may wait just out of sight, operating quietly within its own contained waters. On the northern coast of Indonesia's Papua province lies Chenderawasi Bay, a vast indentation in the island's edge that stretches more than 300 kilometres across. From above, it appears open and generous, framed by forested hills and scattered islands. Yet despite its size, Chenderawasi Bay functions as one of the most ecologically distinctive and partially isolated marine systems in the tropics. Unlike narrow fjords or hypersaline lagoons, its isolation is subtle. It is defined not by a single narrow entrance, but by geography and circulation patterns that reduce exchange with the broader Pacific Ocean. The bay curves inward, partially enclosed by the Bird's Head Peninsula to the west, and by island chains to the north and east. Currents entering from the Pacific weaken as they move deeper into the basin. The scale of Chenderawasi Bay creates its own internal dynamics. Shallow coral reefs line much of the shoreline, while deeper basins sit farther offshore. Numerous small islands dot the interior. These islands interrupt water flow and create eddies, pockets, and slower moving zones. Water clarity in many areas is high. Coral reefs thrive along slopes and around islands. Reef fish diversity is substantial, reflecting Papua's position within the Coral Triangle, the global centre of marine biodiversity. Yet even in such a species-rich region, Chenderawasi Bay stands apart for a particular reason. It is one of the few places in the world where whale sharks appear consistently year-round. Whale sharks, the largest fish on Earth, are typically migratory. In many regions, they arrive seasonally, following plankton blooms or spawning events. In Chenderawasi Bay, however, individuals have been observed remaining for extended periods, some returning regularly to specific areas within the bay. The reason lies partly in human activity and partly in geography. Local fishermen use stationary lift net platforms known as bargan to catch small schooling fish at night. Lights attract plankton, which in turn draw fish. Whale sharks have learned to associate these platforms with food opportunities. Rather than migrating widely in search of unpredictable feeding grounds, some whale sharks linger near these platforms. The bay's semi-enclosed nature reduces strong ocean currents, making it easier for them to remain in defined areas without expending excessive energy. Marine biologists studying whale sharks here have documented individuals over multiple years, identifying them by their unique spot patterns. The relative isolation of the bay facilitates such long-term observation. Sharks do venture beyond its boundaries, but many appear to treat the bay as a reliable feeding habitat. Beyond whale sharks, Chenderawasi Bay supports a wide array of marine life. Coral reefs display high species richness, including hard corals, soft corals, and sponges. Reef fish assemblages include angelfish, wrasses, groupers, and parrotfish. Sea turtles frequent shallow areas. Mangrove forests line parts of the coast, particularly where freshwater streams enter the bay. These mangroves provide nursery habitat for juvenile fish and crustaceans. Their roots stabilise sediment and trap organic material. The bay's depth profile includes both shallow shelves and deeper basins. In deeper areas, water exchange with the open ocean is slower. Stratification can occur seasonally, especially during calm periods when surface waters warm. Isolation here is not absolute. It is moderated by tidal cycles and regional currents. However, compared to more exposed coastal stretches of Papua, the bay's interior waters experience reduced wave energy and less direct current flow. Sediment delivered by rivers from surrounding forested hills enters the bay during heavy rainfall. In areas with limited flushing, sediment can accumulate on the seafloor. Coral reefs near river mouths may be more turbid than those near outer islands. Human population density along the bay's shoreline is relatively low. Small villages dot the coast, many accessible primarily by boat. Infrastructure remains limited compared to other parts of Indonesia. fishing is an important livelihood. In addition to lift nets, local fishermen use small boats and hand lines to catch reef fish. Traditional practices coexist with modern pressures, including demand from broader markets. Chenderawasi Bay has been designated as a marine national park, reflecting its ecological significance. Conservation measures aim to protect whale sharks, coral reefs, and associated biodiversity. Enforcement remains challenging due to the bay's large area and limited resources. The relative isolation of Chenderawasi Bay has allowed certain species to persist in higher abundance than in more heavily exploited regions. Whale sharks, for instance, appear less wary of boats here compared to areas where heavy tourism or fishing pressure exists. Divers in the bay often describe encounters with whale sharks as calm and prolonged. The animals move slowly near platforms, occasionally rising vertically to feed. Their size is unmistakable. Some exceed 10 meters in length, yet their movements are gentle. Acoustic conditions differ from busier Indonesian ports. Outside of localized boat traffic near fishing platforms, underwater noise levels are lower. This quieter environment may reduce stress for large marine animals. The bay's geography also influences storm exposure. While the broader Pacific can experience strong weather systems, the interior of Chenderawasi Bay is somewhat shielded by surrounding landforms. Waves are often smaller than on exposed outer coasts. Temperature patterns reflect tropical conditions, with relatively warm water year-round. Seasonal variation exists but is less extreme than in temperate or polar bays. This stability supports continuous biological productivity. Coral bleaching events linked to marine heat waves have affected parts of Indonesia, including areas within Chenderawasi Bay. However, some reefs within the bay have demonstrated resilience, possibly due to localized circulation patterns that moderate temperature extremes. Genetic studies of reef organisms in semi-enclosed systems sometimes reveal distinct subpopulations compared to fully open reefs. Reduced larval exchange can lead to subtle divergence. Whether such patterns are pronounced in Chenderawasi Bay continues to be an area of research. Bird life along the bay's islands includes seabirds nesting on rocky outcrops. Forested hills behind the coastline host terrestrial species endemic to Papua. The integration of marine and terrestrial systems reinforces the bay's ecological complexity. Water movement through narrow channels between islands creates localized current acceleration, which benefits certain filter-feeding organisms. In calmer interior pockets, sediment settles more easily, supporting different communities. Chenderawasi Bay's scale makes it feel expansive rather than confined. Yet its curvature and surrounding peninsulas shape a partially enclosed marine space, with recognizable internal dynamics. The presence of giant whale sharks within a relatively bounded environment underscores how isolation can foster predictable interactions between species and human activity. The lift net platforms function almost like artificial reefs, concentrating plankton and fish, which in turn attract sharks. Researchers tagging whale sharks with satellite transmitters have found that while some individuals roam widely across Indonesian waters, others remain within or frequently return to the bay. This pattern suggests that Chenderawasi Bay serves as both habitat and waypoint. Local communities increasingly recognize the economic value of whale shark tourism. Responsible practices, including limiting the number of boats and prohibiting direct feeding, aim to reduce disturbance. Isolation here is therefore ecological rather than geographic in the stricter sense. The bay is large and open to the sea, yet its internal circulation patterns, combined with predictable food sources, create a contained environment for certain species. In deeper offshore areas of the bay, research remains limited. The seafloor may host communities not yet fully documented. Semi-enclosed tropical basins can contain mesophotic reefs at moderate depths, where light is reduced but not absent. As with other isolated bays, climate change introduces uncertainty. Sea surface temperatures, ocean acidification, and shifting rainfall patterns could alter productivity and species distribution. Even so, the bay's configuration offers some buffering capacity. Surrounding land reduces direct exposure to certain oceanographic forces. Internal eddies and slower currents create gradients rather than uniform conditions. Standing on the deck of a small boat near a lift net platform at dawn, one might see a dark shape just beneath the surface. A whale shark rises slowly, mouth open, filtering plankton-rich water. Forested hills frame the horizon. The sea appears calm. It is easy in that moment to focus only on the visible giant. Yet beneath the surface lies a layered system shaped by geography, currents, human tradition, and ecological adaptation. Chenderawasi Bay demonstrates that isolation does not always require narrow entrances or dramatic cliffs. Sometimes it arises from broad curvature, partial enclosure, and patterns of circulation that create predictable habitats within a larger ocean. As we move onward to other remote waters around the world, the pattern continues to evolve. In some bays, isolation protects ancient microbial life. In others, it preserves glacially carved vertical ecosystems. Here, in tropical Papua, it provides a stage where giants linger beneath the surface, sustained by the quiet boundaries formed by land and sea, working together over long spans of time. Not all isolation is created by cliffs, reefs, or ice. Sometimes it is created by time. Sometimes the boundary between land and sea shifts so gradually that entire landscapes slip beneath the surface without drama. Forests that once stood in open air now rest underwater. River valleys that once carried fresh water through grasslands are now drowned channels on the seafloor. In certain bays around the world, these drowned landscapes remain preserved, sealed beneath the layers of sediment and quiet water. To understand how a coastline can vanish, it helps to remember that sea level has never been fixed. During the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago, vast amounts of water were locked in ice sheets covering large portions of North America, Europe, and Asia. Global sea level was more than 100 meters lower than it is today. Continental shelves that are now submerged were exposed land. As the climate warmed and ice melted, sea levels rose gradually. The rise was not uniform everywhere, but over thousands of years the ocean advanced inland. Valleys flooded first. Low-lying forests became wetlands, then shallow bays. Eventually, in many places, saltwater replaced freshwater entirely. In semi-enclosed bays where water movement is relatively calm, the remnants of these former landscapes often remain intact. Tree stumps protrude from the seabed. Peat layers lie buried beneath sand. Pollen grains preserved in sediment record plant communities that once grew on dry ground.
One of the most striking examples of a drowned landscape lies beneath the North Sea, in a region known as Doggerland. Today, fishing vessels pass over open water between the United Kingdom and mainland Europe. Beneath those waters once lay a vast plain populated by forests, rivers, and human settlements during the Mesolithic period. As sea levels rose, Doggerland gradually submerged. The final inundation likely occurred around 8,000 years ago, accelerated by a massive underwater landslide off Norway, known as the Storegga Slide, which triggered a tsunami that swept across the region. What had been a habitable landscape became seabed. In calmer, more enclosed coastal bays, similar transitions occurred on smaller scales. Along parts of the eastern United States, remnants of ancient cypress forests have been discovered offshore. Storms occasionally strip away sediment, revealing dark wooden stumps rooted in place, still upright, preserved by anaerobic conditions. These submerged forests are not recent casualties of erosion. Many date back thousands of years. When sea level rose, salt water inundated freshwater forests. In some locations, rapid burial by sediment protected wood from decay. Oxygen-poor conditions slowed decomposition. Within isolated bays where wave energy is reduced and sediment accumulates steadily, preservation can be remarkable. Divers exploring certain shallow coastal areas have encountered tree trunks lying horizontally beneath layers of sand.
Radiocarbon dating confirms their age, often corresponding to post-glacial sea level rise. Sunken forests tell a quiet story about climate and change. They are not dramatic reefs or whale gatherings. They are reminders that the line between land and sea is temporary on geological timescales. In parts of the Gulf of Mexico, divers have documented cypress forests, preserved beneath marine sediment. These trees once grew along freshwater rivers when the coastline lay farther out. As sea level rose, the coastline retreated inland, leaving former floodplains underwater. The existence of these forests beneath modern bays highlights how isolation can develop over time. A valley that once opened to a river becomes an estuary. That estuary, partially enclosed by sandbars or barrier islands, becomes a bay. Within it, layers of history accumulate. Sediment cores extracted from such bays often reveal transitions from terrestrial soil to freshwater peat to marine mud. Each layer corresponds to a different phase in the transformation from forest to bay. In Southeast Asia, submerged shorelines extend beyond current coasts. Rapid sea level rise following glacial melt flooded vast areas of low-lying land. Some archaeologists believe that early human settlements now lie beneath shallow coastal waters in this region, preserved under sediment. In enclosed bays where sedimentation rates are high, archaeological remains may survive for millennia. Stone tools, hearths, and even footprints can remain intact beneath layers of mud. These discoveries challenge assumptions about early coastal populations, suggesting that many ancient sites remain underwater. Submerged peat beds are particularly common in areas that experience rapid shoreline retreat. Peat forms in waterlogged conditions, often in coastal marshes. When sea level rises further and marine sediment covers the peat, it becomes sealed in place. In some bays, erosion or dredging exposes these ancient layers temporarily. Dark, fibrous material contrasts with surrounding sand. Scientists sample these layers to reconstruct vegetation and climate conditions of the past. The presence of drowned coastlines beneath modern bays also influences present-day ecology. Former river channels now function as deeper troughs guiding water circulation. Submerged ridges influence current flow and sediment deposition. In certain tropical bays, remnants of ancient coral reefs lie deeper than modern reefs. These fossil reefs formed when sea level was lower. As water rose, new reef growth established higher up the slope. The older structures remain below, marking previous shoreline positions. Isolation in these systems operates across time rather than space alone. A bay may appear stable within a human lifetime, but over thousands of years it has shifted dramatically. Consider a shallow bay along a temperate coastline. Today it supports seagrass meadows and oyster reefs. Beneath the sediment lies a peat layer representing a marsh that existed 6,000 years ago. Beneath that lies river sand deposited when the coastline lay kilometres farther seaward. Each layer records a boundary that once defined land and water. Each marks a former shoreline that no longer exists. In enclosed bays where wave energy is limited, the preservation of such layers is enhanced. Strong surf on exposed coasts tends to erode and redistribute sediment. Within sheltered bays, layers accumulate steadily. Marine geologists use seismic imaging to map buried channels and ancient shorelines beneath bay floors. These maps reveal networks of drowned river systems branching beneath modern water. In some places, submerged forests have become habitats in their own right. Marine organisms colonize preserved wood. Sponges attach to submerged trunks. Fish shelter among root structures. What was once terrestrial forest becomes artificial reef-like habitat underwater. The transformation is gradual but complete. Leaves that once rustled in wind are replaced by currents moving through branches now coated in algae. Sunken landscapes also alter acoustic properties of a bay. Submerged ridges and channels reflect sound differently than uniform seabeds. For marine animals navigating by sound, these features shape the acoustic map. In parts of Australia, divers have found submerged Aboriginal artefacts in shallow bays where sea level rose after the last ice age. These findings demonstrate that coastal occupation extended farther seaward than modern shorelines indicate. Rising sea levels continue to reshape coasts today, though at a slower rate than post-glacial melt pulses. In low-lying regions, saltwater intrusion into freshwater marshes echoes processes that occurred thousands of years ago. Some coastal forests today are experiencing dieback as saltwater advances inland due to sea level rise and storm surges. These ghost forests of standing dead trees may represent early stages of future submerged landscapes. In certain enclosed bays along the Atlantic coast of North America, cypress stumps occasionally emerge during extreme low tides or after storms remove sediment. These glimpses of former forests connect present-day observers to ancient coastlines. Underwater archaeology in such settings requires careful excavation. Sediment layers protect organic materials, but can be fragile once exposed. Preservation depends on maintaining low oxygen conditions. The isolation of submerged forests beneath bay sediments means they are often protected from scavengers and mechanical disturbance. In oxygen-poor mud, wood can remain intact for thousands of years. Radiocarbon dating of submerged wood provides timelines for sea level rise in specific regions. Combined with sediment analysis, these data help reconstruct rates of change. Lost coastlines are not limited to temperate regions. In parts of Southeast Asia, rapid post-glacial flooding reshaped entire landscapes. The Sunda Shelf, now largely underwater, once connected islands that are today separated by sea. Enclosed bays in these regions may cover former valleys where early human communities lived, hunted, and gathered. Underwater exploration has only begun to reveal the extent of these drowned worlds. Isolation in this context refers to the separation between past and present environments layered atop each other. The bay becomes a time capsule, preserving stages of transition from land to sea. The existence of these submerged landscapes also influences how we understand resilience and change. Coastlines have never been static. They migrate with climate cycles. Bays form and fill, forests drown and reefs grow in their place. Standing at the edge of a modern bay, it is difficult to imagine that the water beneath your feet once covered grassland or woodland. Yet geological evidence makes this clear. In calm, semi-enclosed bays, where sedimentation outpaces erosion, these echoes remain undisturbed for long periods. The quiet water above conceals layers of terrestrial history below. As we continue exploring isolated bays around the world, these submerged forests and drowned valleys remind us that isolation can be temporal as well as spatial. Beneath clear or murky water, beneath seagrass beds and coral slopes, lie traces of coastlines that existed long before current maps were drawn. The bay becomes not just a contained marine ecosystem, but a layered archive. Within it, the boundary between land and sea has shifted repeatedly, leaving behind physical records of each transition. And as sea levels continue to respond to climate forces, new chapters of coastline transformation are already beginning, quietly, beneath the surface of today's familiar shores. If you stand in the centre of a large city and check the weather forecast, you receive a neat summary. Temperature, wind speed, chance of rain. It feels orderly, predictable, as if the sky above that entire region is behaving in one coordinated way. But step into a deeply enclosed bay, surrounded by steep cliffs or dense forest, and that tidy regional forecast begins to fracture. Within isolated bays, weather does not always follow the broader script. It bends around rock walls, it pools in low basins, it accelerates through narrow channels. In some cases, it becomes so locally defined that the conditions inside the bay differ noticeably from the coastline just beyond its entrance. This is the domain of microclimates. These are small-scale atmospheric conditions shaped by terrain, water, vegetation, and elevation. In isolated bays, microclimates can develop with surprising persistence. Start with wind. Wind is rarely uniform. When broad air masses move across an open ocean, they gather speed. But when that moving air encounters high cliffs surrounding a fjord or limestone towers rising from water, it changes direction and velocity. Air can be funneled through narrow inlets, increasing speed locally. In other sections of the same bay, wind may drop almost to nothing. In steep-sided fjords like Milford Sound, katabatic winds occasionally descend from mountain slopes. These winds form when cold air at high elevation becomes dense and flows downhill under gravity. As it reaches the water's surface, it can spread outward across the fjord in sudden gusts. Meanwhile, beyond the fjord's mouth, conditions may remain relatively calm. In tropical limestone systems like Halong Bay, the karst towers disrupt airflow. Morning fog may linger longer within the labyrinth because rock walls reduce mixing. Sunlight heats exposed limestone faces unevenly, creating small thermal gradients that influence air movement between islands. Temperature differences between land and water also drive localized weather patterns. During the day, land heats more quickly than water. Warm air rises above rocky slopes. Cooler air over the bay moves inward to replace it. At night, the process reverses. Land cools rapidly. Air over water remains comparatively warmer. Gentle breezes shift direction accordingly. In enclosed bays, these diurnal cycles can become amplified because surrounding terrain restricts large-scale airflow. The result is a daily rhythm of localized wind that may not match broader coastal patterns. Rainfall distribution can also vary significantly within isolated bays. In areas surrounded by mountains, moist air from the sea is forced upward along slopes. As air rises, it cools and condenses, producing rain. This orographic effect means that one side of a bay may receive far more precipitation than another, only a few kilometers away. In parts of Disco Bay, fog can form when relatively warm ocean water meets cold Arctic air. The bay's shape influences how long fog persists. Narrow fjord arms may trap mist for hours, even when clearer conditions exist offshore. Humidity behaves differently as well. In tropical bays such as Chenderawasi Bay, dense forest surrounding the shoreline releases moisture through transpiration. Combined with evaporation from warm water, this can create a humid envelope over the bay interior that feels heavier than air over open sea. These microclimates influence not just comfort levels for visitors, but biological processes. Temperature, humidity, and wind affect evaporation rates, water mixing, and nutrient cycling. Consider a shallow bay partially enclosed by sandbars. On a hot, calm day, limited wind reduces surface mixing. Water temperature in the interior can rise several degrees higher than in adjacent open water. That slight increase may accelerate plankton growth temporarily. Conversely, in deep fjords where cold air pools at night, surface water temperature may drop more sharply than regional averages. This cooling can influence fish behaviour, pushing certain species deeper during specific hours. Fog formation is particularly common in isolated bays where temperature contrasts exist between land and water. Early morning fog can blanket the surface, reducing light penetration. For photosynthetic organisms near the surface, this delay in sunlight arrival may slightly shift daily metabolic patterns. Cloud cover often forms preferentially over enclosed bays with high humidity. Rising moist air encounters cooler layers aloft, producing localized cloud banks. Satellite imagery sometimes reveals these small cloud formations hovering over individual coastal indentations. In Mediterranean-type climates, isolated bays surrounded by dry hills can experience intense heat during summer days. However, cool marine air trapped overnight may create temperature inversions, where cooler air sits near the surface while warmer air lies above. These inversions can reduce vertical mixing in the atmosphere above the bay. Air pollutants from nearby settlements may linger longer than they would in more exposed coastal areas. The interaction between freshwater input and air temperature adds complexity. In estuarine bays such as Chesapeake Bay, large freshwater inflows during heavy rains can alter surface water temperature. If cooler river water spreads across the surface, it may reduce evaporation locally, influencing humidity above. Microclimates also influence vegetation patterns along shorelines. In bays with consistent moisture and limited wind, temperate rainforests can extend to sea level. In more exposed areas only a few kilometres away, vegetation may shift towards scrub or grassland. In tropical karst bays, limestone cliffs may create shaded zones that remain cooler throughout the day. Plant species adapted to lower light levels establish themselves in these niches. Sun-exposed faces host entirely different communities. The effect extends to animals. Seabirds choose nesting sites partly based on wind exposure. In sheltered coves, certain species may nest lower on cliffs. In windier outer coastlines, they choose higher ledges. Reptiles and amphibians in coastal wetlands depend on humidity and temperature stability. Microclimates within isolated bays can provide refuges during extreme heat or drought. Storm behaviour is altered by topography as well. When cyclonic systems approach enclosed bays, surrounding landforms may weaken wind intensity locally. In other cases, funneling through narrow channels can increase wind speeds in specific sections. Water level responses to storm surges differ in semi-enclosed systems. Wind-driven water can accumulate more rapidly inside a bay with limited outlets, raising local sea levels higher than on adjacent open coasts. Lightning patterns can also vary. Tall cliffs may attract strikes. Frequent thunderstorms in humid tropical bays may be concentrated in interior sections rather than offshore. In polar regions, the interplay between sea ice and air temperature creates unique microclimatic conditions. Ice cover reduces evaporation and moderates temperature swings. When ice retreats, exposed water absorbs solar radiation, warming local air slightly and influencing fog formation. Over long timescales, microclimates can influence erosion patterns. Areas receiving consistent rainfall may experience faster rock weathering. In limestone regions, acidic rainwater accelerates karst development, subtly reshaping the bay's labyrinth. Even sound propagation in air differs. Narrow valleys can channel wind noise. Fog dampens sound. In still, humid air within enclosed bays, distant noises may carry farther than expected. Microclimates do not exist in isolation from global climate systems. They are nested within broader patterns. Yet their local expression can differ enough to shape ecological and human experiences distinctly. Fishermen operating in semi-enclosed bays often learn to read these local weather cues. A subtle shift in wind direction at dawn may indicate afternoon squalls within the bay, even if regional forecasts predict calm conditions. Researchers deploying long-term weather stations in isolated coastal basins frequently record data that diverges from nearby coastal stations only tens of kilometres away. Slight differences in temperature, rainfall and wind patterns accumulate over years. These accumulated differences influence water chemistry, vegetation growth, and even sediment deposition rates. Standing in a quiet cove within a limestone labyrinth, watching mist cling to rock faces while open sea beyond remains clear, it becomes apparent that weather here belongs partly to the place itself. The shape of the land moulds the air above it. In a steep fjord at dusk, cold air sliding down from snow-covered peaks may settle onto the water's surface, forming a thin veil of fog while sunlight still illuminates the outer coast. In a tropical bay ringed by mangroves, humidity may linger into late evening, keeping temperatures warm long after inland areas cool. These localized atmospheric patterns are subtle but persistent. They shape daily life for organisms and people alike. As we continue tracing the many dimensions of isolation within the world's most secluded bays, microclimates remind us that boundaries are not only horizontal in space, they exist vertically between air and water, and they form wherever geography constrains movement. Within each enclosed basin, the sky above responds to the contours below. Weather bends to rock, forest and water, and in those contained pockets, climate becomes personal to the bay itself, belonging not to the wider coastline, but to the curve of land and sea that defines its quiet interior. If you stand at the edge of a remote bay and close your eyes, the first thing you may notice is not what you see, but what you do not hear. No steady hum of distant highways, no constant drone of cargo ships crossing open water. Perhaps only the soft movement of water against rock, the brief call of a seabird, the low exhale of wind moving down a cliff face. It feels quiet. But quiet in the ocean is never truly silent. It is layered. Sound travels far more efficiently in water than in air. A low-frequency signal can move for kilometres, even hundreds of kilometres, in open ocean. In busy coastal regions, that space is saturated with mechanical noise. Propellers, engines, sonar systems, construction, and seismic surveys all contribute to a background hum that rarely fades. Inside isolated bays, especially those with limited vessel traffic and narrow entrances, the acoustic landscape changes. It becomes smaller in range, more reflective, more contained. The boundaries of rock, sediment and stratified water shape how sound moves. Start with simple geometry. In open ocean, sound waves radiate outward in broad arcs. In a fjord or semi-enclosed basin, those waves strike vertical rock walls and return. Echoes form, reflections overlap. The result is a complex pattern of interference that depends on the shape of the basin. In steep fjords like Milford Sound, underwater sound can bounce repeatedly between opposing walls. Marine mammals using echolocation, such as dolphins, must interpret returning signals carefully. In confined spaces, echoes arrive more quickly and from multiple angles. The acoustic map is denser. In tropical labyrinth systems such as Halong Bay, limestone towers rising from shallow water create narrow channels where sound refracts around corners. Boat engines echo unpredictably. Even small movements, like a paddle dipping into water, produce sharp, localized noise that travels through confined passages. The absence of heavy ship traffic in many isolated bays reduces chronic low-frequency noise. In open shipping lanes, large vessels emit continuous sound at frequencies that overlap with whale communication. That noise can mask calls and interfere with navigation. In quieter bays, marine mammals may communicate over shorter but clearer distances. Acoustic studies conducted in remote Arctic systems such as Disco Bay reveal periods during winter when sea ice dampens surface noise. Ice cover acts like a barrier, reducing wind-driven wave noise. Beneath the ice, the underwater environment can become acoustically stable. Marine mammals vocalizing under these conditions may experience clearer signal transmission within the enclosed basin. Stratification also plays a role. When water forms layers of differing temperature and salinity, sound waves bend as they travel between them. This bending, known as refraction, alters how far and in what direction sound propagates.
In estuarine systems like Chesapeake Bay, strong summer stratification can trap sound within certain layers. A signal emitted near the surface may not travel efficiently into deeper hypoxic zones. Conversely, sounds generated at depth may remain confined beneath the surface layer. In tropical basins like Chenderawasi Bay, warm surface water overlays cooler, deeper water. Depending on seasonal temperature gradients, acoustic channels may form that guide sound horizontally within specific depth ranges. Sound in isolated bays is often dominated by biological sources. Snapping shrimp produce rapid clicks that collectively form a constant crackling background in many shallow coastal waters. In confined basins with limited anthropogenic noise, this biological chorus becomes more apparent. Certain fish species generate low-frequency hums or pulses during spawning seasons. These choruses typically intensify at dusk. In remote bays, hydrophones placed near reef edges have recorded distinct nightly peaks in acoustic activity corresponding to fish reproductive behavior. Marine mammals adapt their communication strategies according to the acoustic properties of their environment. Dolphins in narrow fjords may adjust call frequency or amplitude to compensate for reverberation. Whales entering semi-enclosed bays may produce shorter calls to reduce echo overlap. Seals vocalizing underwater create sounds that bounce off basin walls. In quiet systems, these sounds may travel farther without masking interference from boats. The physical composition of the seabed influences acoustics as well. Muddy sediment absorbs sound differently than rocky substrate. In enclosed bays where fine sediment accumulates, low-frequency sounds may attenuate more quickly compared to rocky open coasts. Submerged forests and drowned landscapes, like those buried beneath certain coastal bays, create uneven bottom topography that reflects and scatters sound in complex ways. Old tree trunks, peat layers, and ancient channels contribute to irregular acoustic signatures. Wind noise above water also affects underwater sound. In exposed coasts, wind-driven waves create constant surface turbulence. In sheltered bays with limited fetch, wave energy is reduced. Surface noise decreases, especially during calm weather. However, isolation does not guarantee silence. In popular tourist destinations, boat engines can dominate acoustic space despite geographic enclosure. The difference lies in persistence. In remote systems with limited traffic, quiet intervals may last hours or days. In busy ports, noise is continuous. Researchers studying acoustic ecology use hydrophones to monitor long-term changes. By comparing soundscapes across isolated and non-isolated bays, they identify differences in biological and anthropogenic contributions.
In some remote bays, scientists have documented deal patterns where biological noise peaks at night, while daytime remains relatively subdued. In contrast, in developed coastal areas, daytime mechanical noise overwhelms natural patterns. The acoustic environment influences predator-prey interactions. Fish that rely on subtle sound cues to detect predators may respond differently in quieter waters. Prey species may feel less stressed when background noise is low, altering foraging behaviour. Certain crustaceans depend on sound to locate suitable habitats. Larval reef fish use reef noise as a cue for settlement. In enclosed bays with healthy reefs and low anthropogenic noise, these acoustic signals may be clearer and more localised. Isolation can also amplify the impact of sudden noises. A single loud engine revving in a narrow fjord can reverberate intensely, startling animals accustomed to quieter conditions. In Arctic regions, calving glaciers produce sharp cracking sounds that echo across enclosed waters. These natural events contribute to the acoustic identity of the bay. In limestone labyrinth systems, dripping water within caves generates rhythmic echoes that carry into submerged passages. The transition between air-filled cave acoustics and underwater acoustics can be abrupt. Temperature gradients in enclosed bays shift seasonally, altering sound speed profiles. During warm summer months, surface layers may transmit sound differently than in cooler seasons.
Acoustic isolation extends above water as well. Cliffs surrounding certain bays block external noise from inland areas. A bay enclosed by steep rock may shield its interior from highway noise, even if a road lies only a few kilometers away on the other side of a ridge. For humans, the perceived quietness of isolated bays often shapes emotional responses. Calm acoustic environments can feel expansive despite physical confinement. The absence of constant background noise allows subtle sounds to stand out. For marine organisms, sound is not simply ambience. It is navigation, communication, and survival. In isolated systems, acoustic boundaries reinforce spatial ones. Consider a small lagoon accessible only through a narrow cave passage. Inside, water is calm. Sound from outside arrives muted. Fish and invertebrates within experience a distinct acoustic microhabitat. In a large semi-enclosed bay, whale calls may carry across the basin, but not beyond its mouth with equal intensity. The bay becomes an acoustic chamber of limited range. Long-term monitoring of remote bays has shown that even slight increases in boat traffic can alter baseline sound levels significantly. Isolation offers relative quiet, but it is sensitive to change. In some regions, Conservationists have proposed acoustic sanctuaries, areas where vessel noise is restricted to preserve natural soundscapes. Semi-enclosed bays are natural candidates for such efforts due to their contained geography. As we continue examining the dimensions of isolation in the world's most secluded bays, sound adds another layer. Boundaries do not only restrict water flow or species movement, they shape the movement of vibrations through water and air. Within rock walls, beneath freshwater layers, above sedimented basins, sound behaves according to physical laws shaped by the contours of the bay. The result is an acoustic environment that belongs to the place itself. In still water, isolation does not erase sound. It refines it. It contains it. It allows natural rhythms to surface without constant interruption. And in those contained acoustic chambers, life communicates, navigates, and responds within boundaries drawn not only by geography, but by vibration moving quietly through confined space. Long before satellites mapped coastlines and sonar traced the seafloor, isolated bays were both refuge and risk. Their narrow entrances offered shelter from storms. Their calm interiors allowed ships to anchor safely. Yet the same cliffs and hidden reefs that protected vessels could just as easily trap them. Across the world's secluded bays, beneath still water and drifting sediment, lie shipwrecks that tell quiet stories of navigation, miscalculation, trade, and survival. A bay that appears calm on a clear day can be deceptive. Shallow sills, submerged rocks, sudden fog, or shifting sandbars have ended voyages within sight of safety. In enclosed waters, once a vessel runs aground or strikes a hidden reef, escape is difficult. Waves may be smaller than on open coasts, but confinement limits maneuvering space. In the limestone maze of Halong Bay, historical trade routes passed between karst islands. For centuries, small wooden vessels carried goods through these channels. Sudden storms or navigational errors could push a boat against sharp rock faces. Some hulls splintered in shallow water, settling quietly beneath the surface. In colder waters like Disco Bay, ice posed constant danger. Drifting icebergs, unpredictable currents, and freezing conditions challenged even experienced sailors. Ships caught in pack ice sometimes became trapped, crushed slowly by pressure. Fragments of wooden hulls, iron fittings, and cargo remnants remain scattered in Arctic bays, preserved by cold water. In tropical systems, such as Chenderawasi Bay, wartime shipwrecks from the 20th century rest on the seafloor. During World War II, naval engagements across the Pacific left vessels damaged or sunk in remote bays. Over decades, coral has colonized metal hulls. Fish shelter and engine rooms now open to the sea. What began as instruments of conflict have become artificial reefs. Shipwrecks in isolated bays often remain undisturbed longer than those near busy ports. Limited wave energy reduces structural collapse. Fewer salvage operations reach remote sites. Sediment may cover portions of wrecks gradually, preserving them beneath layers of mud. Each wreck becomes a time capsule. Cargo may still lie scattered nearby. Bottles, ceramics, tools, and personal items occasionally surface in archaeological surveys. In some bays, wooden planks remain intact due to low oxygen conditions that slow decay. Legends grow around these wrecks. Local communities pass down stories of ships that vanished in fog or storms. Tales shift over generations. A trading vessel becomes a pirate ship in retelling. A routine grounding transforms into a dramatic tale of hidden treasure. Fog plays a central role in many maritime legends. In steep fjords like Milford Sound, mist can descend quickly, obscuring cliffs and narrowing passages. Sailors navigating without modern instruments relied on visual landmarks in dead reckoning. A sudden loss of visibility increased the risk of collision with rock walls. In estuarine systems like Chesapeake Bay, Shifting shoals and sandbars have claimed numerous vessels over centuries. Charts improved gradually, but before precise mapping, captains relied heavily on local knowledge. Even today, submerged remains of colonial-era ships lie buried in sediment. Isolation intensifies the emotional weight of such stories. In a crowded harbor, a wreck becomes an inconvenience. Removed quickly. In a remote bay, it becomes part of the landscape. Generations grow up knowing the location of a sunken hull just offshore. Human whispers extend beyond physical wreckage. Coastal caves and enclosed bays often contain carvings, markings, or artifacts left by earlier visitors. Fishermen sheltering from storms may have etched initials into limestone walls. Explorers might have left simple markers. In some regions, indigenous oral histories describe bays as sacred or dangerous. Stories of spirits inhabiting certain coves or warnings about particular inlets reflect both cultural meaning and practical knowledge about hidden hazards. The psychological dimension of isolation shapes these narratives. A narrow entrance feels like a threshold. Crossing into a quiet basin surrounded by steep terrain creates a sense of enclosure. For sailors unfamiliar with such geography, the experience could feel disorienting. Underwater, shipwrecks alter local ecosystems. Coral attaches to hulls in tropical bays. Sponges colonize shaded metal surfaces. Fish aggregate around structural complexity provided by broken masts and beams. In colder bays, encrusting organisms cover iron fittings. Wood-boring organisms may be limited by low salinity or temperature, preserving timbers longer than in warmer open seas. Archaeologists studying shipwrecks in semi-enclosed bays often note higher preservation quality compared to exposed coasts. Reduced current strength and lower wave energy minimize physical disturbance. Some wrecks become dive sites, drawing visitors who seek both history and marine life. Responsible tourism can bring awareness and funding for preservation. Unregulated visitation, however, risks damage from souvenir collection or anchor strikes. Isolation sometimes allowed small communities to use wreck materials for survival. In remote coastal villages, timber from grounded ships was salvaged for building homes or repairing boats. Iron fittings were repurposed. Stories of such salvage operations become part of local identity. Bays with difficult entrances have long been associated with smuggling. Hidden coves provided discreet anchorages away from main trade routes. Narrow channels limited pursuit. Oral histories in various parts of the world mention contraband goods moved through secluded waters. Natural hazards also contribute to legend. In karst regions, underwater caves connect to enclosed lagoons. Sudden tidal surges through narrow passages can create strong currents. A small boat caught unaware might capsize, giving rise to cautionary tales. Acoustic isolation amplifies human presence in these settings. The creak of wood, the splash of oars, the echo of voices carry differently in enclosed basins. At night, small sounds seem magnified. Shipwrecks in isolated bays also record technological transitions. Wooden sailing vessels give way to steamships. Steamships give way to steel-hulled cargo vessels. Each era leaves distinct remains. Metal hulls corrode over decades. Rust stains sediment. Marine growth gradually softens sharp edges. Eventually, only fragments remain visible above sand. In Arctic bays, cold water slows corrosion. In tropical waters, biological growth may conceal structural details more quickly. Modern technology has revealed wrecks once hidden. Side-scan sonar and remotely operated vehicles map seafloors in high resolution. Archaeologists can now locate submerged structures with greater accuracy, even in turbid or deep water. Yet many wrecks in isolated bays remain undocumented. Sediment shifts bury and reveal them over time. Storms may expose timbers briefly before covering them again. The human presence in these bays is often quiet compared to their geological and biological dimensions. A few scattered fishing boats, a lighthouse marking a dangerous shoal, a weathered dock at the edge of a forest. Still, every isolated bay with a history of navigation holds layers of human memory. Trade routes passed through them. Storms altered lives within them. Decisions made on their waters carried consequences. Legends persist because isolation invites imagination. A calm surface can conceal debris below. A narrow entrance suggests secrecy. Fog rolling across still water creates atmosphere ripe for storytelling. In some cases, modern maritime accidents continue the pattern. Smaller recreational vessels misjudge depth or weather. Even with GPS and updated charts, human error persists. The difference now is documentation. News travels quickly, rescue operations deploy faster. Yet in remote bays with limited connectivity, response times may still be delayed. Shipwrecks become landmarks on nautical charts, warnings etched in coordinates. They also become habitat, archive, and narrative. Standing at the shoreline of a secluded bay at dusk, one might see only gentle ripples reflecting fading light. Beneath that surface may lie timber laid down a century ago, iron beams resting quietly under coral growth, or cargo scattered in a pattern frozen in time. Human whispers in these bays are layered, much like sediment. Stories of survival, trade, conflict, and adaptation mingle with geological and biological processes. Isolation preserves more than ecosystems. It preserves fragments of human endeavor, sometimes by accident, sometimes by design. As we continue moving through the many dimensions of the world's most secluded bays, the presence of shipwrecks and legends reminds us that even the quietest waters have hosted ambition and risk. Beneath calm surfaces lie traces of movement, intention, and memory, resting in contained spaces where land and sea meet and where history settles gently into the sand. For most of human history, isolated bays remain places observed from a distance or known only to those who live nearby. Steep cliffs, narrow entrances, seasonal ice, or vast stretches of open water discourage sustained study. Knowledge accumulated slowly through fishing practices, seasonal travel, and oral tradition. Only in the last century has systematic science begun to reach these enclosed waters with regular intent. When science arrives in an isolated bay, it often does so quietly. A small research vessel appears at the entrance. Equipment cases are unloaded. Instruments are lowered into water that may not have been measured in detail before. The arrival is rarely dramatic. It is careful, logistical. In places like Chenderawasi Bay, researchers studying whale sharks coordinate with local fishermen. Tagging operations require small boats rather than large research ships. Satellite transmitters are attached gently near the dorsal fin. Data begins flowing back to laboratories thousands of kilometers away. In Arctic systems, such as Disco Bay, science often arrives in narrow seasonal windows. Ice conditions determine timing. Research vessels navigate between drifting icebergs. Moorings are deployed to record temperature, salinity, and current patterns over winter months when direct access becomes impossible. In temperate estuaries like Chesapeake Bay, research may feel more routine because of nearby institutions and infrastructure. Yet even here, studying deeper hypoxic zones requires careful planning. Sensors must be calibrated. Boats must navigate shipping lanes in shallow areas. In steep fjords such as Milford Sound, the vertical structure of the environment shapes research design. Divers descending through freshwater layers document black coral colonies that thrive at shallower depths than expected. Instruments measure how tannin-rich runoff affects light penetration. Each isolated bay presents unique challenges. Equipment must withstand corrosion, wave action, sedimentation, and biological growth. In remote tropical lagoons within Halong Bay, researchers studying enclosed water chemistry must transport instruments through narrow cave passages accessible only at certain tide levels. Logistics dominate early phases of fieldwork. Fuel, food, and safety equipment must be secured. Weather windows must be respected. In areas with limited communication infrastructure, satellite phones replace cellular networks. Scientific sampling in remote bays often relies on relatively small teams. Space aboard research vessels is limited. Workdays begin early, timed with tides. Instruments such as CTD profilers are lowered overboard to record conductivity, temperature, and depth. Water samples are collected in bottles at specific intervals. In deeper basins, sediment cores are extracted using gravity cores or piston cores. These cylindrical samples reveal layers deposited over centuries or millennia. In semi-enclosed systems, sediment records can be particularly detailed because disturbance is minimal. Biologists deploy underwater cameras to document reef health, fish abundance, and invertebrate communities. In isolated systems, baseline data may be sparse. Each survey fills gaps. Acoustic monitoring is increasingly common. Hydrophones anchored to the seabed record ambient sound over months. Researchers later analyze patterns of biological activity and anthropogenic noise. Remote sensing complements in-person fieldwork. Satellite imagery tracks surface temperature and chlorophyll concentrations. Drones map coastline changes. However, many processes within isolated bays require direct measurement. Field stations sometimes emerge on rugged shorelines. Simple wooden structures house equipment and sleeping quarters. Solar panels provide limited power. Researchers may remain on site for weeks, documenting seasonal transitions. Collaboration with local communities is often essential. Indigenous knowledge can guide sampling locations. Fishermen may identify areas of unusual fish behavior. In many regions, long-term monitoring programs rely on partnerships rather than isolated academic efforts. Funding constraints shape the scale of research. Remote expeditions are costly. Transporting heavy equipment by boat or small aircraft increases expenses. As a result, some isolated bays remain understudied compared to more accessible coastal areas. Climate change has increased urgency. Scientists now race to document baseline conditions before warming, acidification, and sea level rise alter ecosystems irreversibly. In polar bays, autonomous underwater vehicles are sometimes deployed beneath sea ice. These robotic systems collect data and conditions too dangerous for divers. They map bathymetry and record water chemistry under ice cover. In tropical systems, researchers study coral bleaching events by measuring temperature anomalies and surveying coral health over time. Repeated visits are required to detect recovery or decline. Sampling in enclosed bays often reveals distinct patterns compared to open coastlines. Reduced water exchange can amplify local nutrient cycles. Oxygen depletion may occur in deeper layers. Genetic studies may uncover isolated subpopulations of fish or invertebrates. Scientists studying stromatolites in Shark Bay, for example, carefully measure salinity, light levels, and microbial composition. These living structures grow slowly. Long-term observation is required to understand subtle changes. Fieldwork in isolated bays is rarely glamorous. Equipment fails. Weather shifts suddenly. Anchors drag in unexpected currents. Yet incremental data collection builds comprehensive understanding over time. Technological advances have expanded reach. Compact sensors can log data autonomously for months. Satellite tags on marine animals reveal movement patterns across and beyond enclosed basins. Data collected from isolated bays often challenge assumptions formed from studies in more open systems. Ecological processes may operate at different scales. Recovery rates after disturbance may differ. Interdisciplinary approaches are common. Oceanographers collaborate with ecologists, geologists, and climate scientists. Sediment analysis informs biological interpretation. Acoustic data complements visual surveys. In some remote bays, research has led to conservation designation. Documentation of high biodiversity or unique species can support marine protected area status. Scientific presence also raises ethical considerations. Researchers must minimize disturbance. Anchor placement, diver activity, and sampling intensity require careful management. Long-term monitoring is particularly valuable in isolated systems because natural variability can be high. Multi-year datasets reveal patterns not visible in short expeditions. Community engagement helps translate scientific findings into policy. Fishermen informed about spawning cycles may adjust practices. Tourism operators may adopt guidelines to protect sensitive habitats. In regions where shipwrecks rest undisturbed, maritime archaeologists conduct underwater surveys to document historical remains before corrosion advances further. Scientists studying microclimates deploy weather stations along enclosed shorelines. Data collected at fine scales reveal how temperature, humidity, and wind vary within small geographic ranges. Remote bays serve as natural laboratories. Their partial isolation allows researchers to examine how ecosystems function with limited external influence. Comparing these systems to heavily trafficked coastlines highlights the effects of human pressure. Fieldwork often ends as quietly as it begins. Instruments are retrieved, samples are secured, boats depart, data analysis continues in distant laboratories. Yet the impact of those visits can be lasting. Baseline records established today may become reference points decades later. In many cases, isolated bays remain only partially understood. Deep basins have not been fully mapped. Seasonal variations are incompletely documented. Genetic connectivity with neighboring systems may still be unclear. Scientific exploration is cumulative. Each expedition adds resolution to an evolving picture. When science arrives by boat, it brings tools designed to measure what cannot be seen from shore. Temperature gradients, oxygen levels, acoustic patterns, microbial communities, sediment histories. The act of studying these unreachable places narrows the gap between isolation and understanding. Geography may limit access, but persistent observation gradually reveals internal dynamics. As our exploration of the world's most secluded bays continues, the presence of research vessels signals a shift. These waters are no longer entirely hidden. They are becoming documented, measured, and interpreted. Yet even with instruments lowered into deep basins and satellites tracking animal movements, a measure of mystery remains. Each isolated bay retains complexities shaped by structure, climate, and time. Science approaches carefully, aware that in contained waters shaped by natural boundaries, answers emerge slowly, one data set at a time, carried back across narrow entrances to the wider world beyond. In most places on Earth, time feels standardized. Sunrise arrives according to a schedule. Seasons shift in predictable patterns. Migration routes follow broad regional cues. Human calendars overlay these rhythms with even greater precision. But inside isolated bays, ecological time does not always align neatly with the clocks we carry or the forecasts issued for the surrounding coastline. Time in these enclosed waters is shaped by restriction, by delayed exchange, by contained circulation, by boundaries that slow the arrival of change and sometimes prolong its effects. Consider a semi-enclosed basin where water renewal happens slowly because of a shallow sill at the entrance. When temperature rises in surrounding open ocean waters, the shift does not always penetrate immediately. The interior basin may remain cooler for weeks longer than expected. Species within respond not to the broader regional warming, but to their local thermal clock. In Arctic systems like Disco Bay, seasonal light cycles dominate biological timing. Winter darkness suppresses primary productivity. Plankton populations remain low beneath ice cover. Then, within a narrow window of increasing daylight in spring, growth accelerates rapidly. The bloom may last only weeks, yet it defines the feeding schedule for fish, seabirds, and marine mammals. Because ice retreat timing varies from year to year, the ecological calendar shifts. If ice melts earlier, plankton blooms begin sooner. Species dependent on that bloom must adjust their reproductive timing accordingly. In an isolated bay, where exchange with broader currents is limited, mismatches between bloom timing and predator arrival can have amplified consequences. In temperate estuaries such as Chesapeake Bay, stratification introduces a layered sense of time. Surface waters warm quickly in spring. Deeper waters respond more slowly. Oxygen depletion in bottom layers develops gradually over summer as organic matter sinks and decomposes. The appearance of hypoxic zones follows an annual rhythm. Fish and crabs learn to avoid certain depths during predictable months. When autumn storms mix the water column, oxygen returns to deeper layers. The cycle resets. In fjords like Milford Sound, heavy rainfall influences timing as much as temperature does. Freshwater layers thicken during wet periods, reducing light penetration into saltwater below. Organisms living at the interface between layers adjust feeding and reproductive activity accordingly. Rain events do not follow strict daily schedules. They arrive in bursts. The ecological clock in such systems includes irregular pulses layered atop seasonal cycles. In tropical basins like Chenderawasi Bay, where temperature variation across the year is relatively small, other cues define timing. Monsoon-driven rainfall alters nutrient input. Fishing activity around stationary platforms may create consistent food availability for species like whale sharks. When food supply becomes predictable due to human structures, animal movement patterns can shift. Migration routes that once followed seasonal plankton blooms may adjust to remain near stable feeding sources. The ecological clock becomes partially decoupled from purely natural cycles. In hypersaline environments such as Shark Bay, evaporation rates shape long-term biological timing. During extended dry periods, salinity rises gradually. Organisms tolerant of higher salinity may gain advantage over others. When rainfall increases, salinity may decline, shifting competitive balances again. These shifts do not occur overnight. They unfold across months or years. In partially isolated basins, the effects may linger longer than in open coasts where rapid mixing resets conditions. Isolation slows some processes while intensifying others. In a bay with limited flushing, nutrient accumulation can build steadily until a threshold is reached. A plankton bloom may then occur abruptly, followed by oxygen decline in deeper water. The interval between such events forms a repeating pattern, but the length of that interval depends on local constraints. Water renewal rate becomes part of the ecological clock. Genetic evolution also operates on its own timeline in isolated bays. Reduced gene flow means that small populations may diverge gradually over centuries. These changes are invisible within a single human lifetime, but measurable across generations. In certain semi-enclosed lagoons within Halong Bay, tidal exchange through narrow caves occurs twice daily. The interior lagoon experiences brief pulses of new water, followed by extended calm periods. Plankton and juvenile fish time their movements with tidal cycles, creating microrhythms within the larger seasonal framework. Time in such systems is layered. Tidal cycles measured in hours, seasonal shifts measured in months, climatic oscillations measured in years, and geological transformations measured in millennia. Submerged forests buried beneath coastal sediment remind us that the coastline itself moves according to a slower clock. Sea level rise following the last glacial maximum unfolded over thousands of years. Forests drowned gradually, not instantly. Peat layers accumulated before being sealed by marine mud. Within a single isolated bay, these timescales coexist. Daily tides lap against shores shaped by processes spanning millions of years. Organisms spawn according to cues tied to lunar cycles, while tectonic forces slowly alter basin depth. Soundscapes also follow temporal rhythms. In quiet bays, fish choruses intensify at dusk during spawning seasons. Snapping shrimp maintain constant crackling background noise, punctuated by occasional louder bursts. When human activity increases seasonally due to tourism, acoustic patterns shift temporarily. Microclimates introduce yet another clock. In enclosed basins, morning fog may persist longer than on open coastlines. Sunlight reaches the water surface later. Photosynthetic organisms begin their daily activity slightly delayed compared to nearby exposed shores. Wind patterns influenced by surrounding terrain may follow consistent diurnal cycles. Calm mornings give way to afternoon gusts funneled through narrow entrances. Organisms living near the surface adjust feeding times accordingly. In polar bays, ice thickness determines not just movement, but sound, light, and predator access. A few additional weeks of ice cover can compress feeding opportunities for migratory birds and mammals. Ecological clocks are not mechanical. They respond to feedback. If one year's bloom fails due to unusual temperature patterns, reproductive success for certain species may decline. The effects ripple into subsequent seasons. In partially isolated systems, recovery from disturbance may take longer because replenishment from outside populations is limited. A fish population reduced by overharvesting may require multiple reproductive cycles to rebound. Conversely, isolation can buffer against rapid change. If an invasive species spreads along open coasts, a narrow entrance or unfavorable salinity gradient may delay its arrival inside a bay. Climate change complicates established rhythms. Earlier springs, warmer summers, altered rainfall patterns, and rising sea levels shift the baseline upon which ecological clocks operate. In some bays, long-term monitoring has revealed gradual advancement of plankton blooms over decades. Migratory species that fail to adjust may arrive too late to capitalize on peak food availability. Human calendars intersect with these natural cycles. Fishing seasons are regulated according to spawning times. Tourism peaks during calm weather months. Scientific expeditions align with accessible conditions. Yet the bay itself responds to forces beyond human scheduling. A sudden storm can reset sediment distribution. A heat wave can trigger coral bleaching within days. The idea that time moves differently in isolated bays is not metaphorical. It is observable in temperature curves, oxygen graphs, reproductive cycles, and sediment layers. Inside a narrow fjord, a week of heavy rainfall can alter freshwater stratification significantly. In a hypersaline lagoon, a single storm may dilute surface salinity temporarily before evaporation restores previous levels. Even individual organisms experience altered pacing. Fish in stable, low-temperature basins may grow more slowly but live longer. Microbial communities in oxygen-poor sediments metabolize at reduced rates compared to well-oxygenated systems. Standing at the edge of a quiet enclosed bay at dawn, watching light gradually illuminate still water, one might sense a slower tempo. Boats may not pass frequently, waves may not break loudly. The impression of stillness aligns with measurable ecological processes unfolding at deliberate rates. Isolation does not freeze time, it reshapes it. It lengthens certain intervals, compresses others, and layers cycles atop one another in ways that differ from more open, rapidly mixed coastlines. As we continue moving through these secluded waters around the world, the concept of time expands. It becomes less about clocks and more about renewal rates, bloom timing, stratification periods, and evolutionary drift. Within each enclosed basin, ecological clocks tick according to constraints defined by geography and climate. The wider ocean may surge and shift beyond the entrance, but inside, processes unfold on their own schedule, governed by the quiet boundaries that shape how quickly change can enter and how long its effects can remain.
Stand at the rim of an isolated bay and notice what happens internally. The landscape does not move toward you. It does not demand attention with noise or speed. Instead, it contains itself. Steep walls or distant peninsulas create a visible boundary. Water rests inside that boundary. The horizon narrows. Movement slows. There is something about that containment that draws people in. Humans are deeply responsive to edges, coastlines, cliffs, forest clearings, doorways, cave entrances. We are wired to notice thresholds between environments. An isolated bay is a large natural threshold. It is neither fully open ocean nor entirely enclosed land. It sits in between. Psychologists studying environmental perception describe a balance between prospect and refuge. Prospect refers to the ability to see outward across a landscape. Refuge refers to the sense of shelter or protection. Isolated bays often offer both simultaneously. From a high cliff overlooking a fjord, you can see across the water while feeling shielded by surrounding terrain. That combination creates a subtle tension. The open water suggests possibility. The enclosing land suggests safety. The mind responds to both. In places like Milford Sound, vertical rock faces reinforce this feeling. The walls are imposing, yet they form a contained space. Visitors often describe a sense of being held within the landscape rather than exposed to it. In Arctic regions such as Disco Bay, drifting icebergs add another layer. The bay feels vast, but the ice marks limits. There is space to move, but not without awareness of boundaries. Humans also associate isolation with authenticity. In a world saturated with infrastructure, signals and schedules, a quiet enclosed bay feels removed from constant input. The absence of visible roads, large buildings or dense traffic signals a break from routine. This perception does not require complete remoteness. Even within a populated region like Chesapeake Bay, small creeks winding through marshland can feel psychologically distant from nearby cities. A narrow inlet framed by reeds can create a pocket of separation, measured in meters rather than kilometers. The brain interprets reduced sensory input as calm. Lower noise levels, slower visual motion, and repetitive wave patterns decrease cognitive load. Attention can shift from monitoring external threats to internal reflection. Water plays a central role in this response. Research into blue space suggests that proximity to water reduces stress and improves mood. Enclosed bays amplify this effect because water is not just present, it is framed. It becomes a focal element. The curvature of a bay naturally guides the eye. Unlike open ocean horizons that stretch infinitely, a bay's edges provide closure. Closure allows the mind to process space more easily. Isolation also invites imagination. When a bay is partially hidden from the wider sea, it feels like a contained world. Stories form more readily in bounded spaces. Shipwreck legends, hidden lagoons, submerged forests. The mind fills in unseen details. In labyrinthian systems like Halong Bay, narrow channels between limestone towers create a sense of discovery. Each turn reveals another enclosed pocket. Curiosity is sustained because the full layout is not visible at once. Humans are drawn to environments that are legible, but not fully predictable. Too much exposure feels unsafe. Too much enclosure feels restrictive. Isolated bays often strike a balance. There is also a temporal dimension to this fascination. In enclosed waters where sound is muted and movement is slower, time feels altered. Without constant stimuli, internal rhythms become more noticeable. Breathing, footsteps, the lapping of water. In tropical basins like Chenderawasi Bay, calm surface conditions and distant forested hills can create a sense of scale that is both expansive and contained. The presence of large marine life such as whale sharks reinforces awe, yet the surrounding bay frames the encounter. Awe itself is a psychological response to vastness, combined with the need for cognitive accommodation. Isolated bays often present vertical cliffs, deep water, or layered landscapes that exceed everyday scale. Yet because the space is enclosed, it remains comprehensible. Fog adds another element. In steep fjords or cool temperate bays, mist rolling across still water reduces visibility gradually. Edges soften, sound dampens, sensory information decreases, enhancing introspection. Humans have long associated secluded coastal inlets with retreat. Monasteries were built near sheltered coves. Small fishing villages developed in bays protected from storms. The physical safety of enclosed waters translated into psychological security. At the same time, isolation can evoke unease. Narrow entrances and steep walls may trigger mild claustrophobic responses in some individuals. The sense of being cut off from open ocean can feel confining. This duality contributes to fascination. The bay is both refuge and boundary. It offers escape from broader exposure while reminding us of limits. The edge of water itself carries symbolic meaning. It marks transition between solid ground and fluid movement. Standing at that edge, especially in a contained bay, emphasizes awareness of change and stability at once. Acoustic qualities influence perception. In quiet bays, echoes return quickly from rock walls. Voices carry differently. The soundscape feels intimate. The absence of continuous mechanical noise heightens awareness of small natural sounds. Environmental psychologists note that moderate complexity in landscapes increases engagement. Too uniform, and the mind disengages. Too chaotic, and it becomes overwhelmed. Isolated bays often present layered textures: rock, water, vegetation, sky. The presence of visible boundaries reduces uncertainty. Unlike open ocean, where depth and distance are abstract, a bay's edges are defined. The mind can map the space more easily. This mapping fosters a sense of orientation. Even if the bay is remote geographically, it feels navigable conceptually. The psychology of the edge also connects to evolutionary history. Early human communities depended on coastal resources. Sheltered bays offered reliable fishing grounds and protection from storms. Over generations, such environments became associated with survival. Modern fascination may reflect inherited preference for resource-rich yet defensible spaces. Isolation amplifies sensory contrasts. Calm interior water juxtaposed with rougher open sea beyond a narrow entrance highlights transition. Crossing that threshold by boat can feel like entering another domain. Writers and artists frequently depict secluded bays as settings for reflection, transformation, or revelation. The contained environment mirrors internal states. Even brief visits can leave lasting impressions. A kayak gliding across still water between towering cliffs creates an embodied sense of scale and quiet. Scientific understanding of ecological isolation adds another layer. Knowing that unique species or distinct processes operate within a bay enhances appreciation. The place feels not only visually enclosed, but functionally distinct. Yet fascination does not depend on scientific knowledge. It arises instinctively when encountering boundaries shaped by land and water. Standing alone at dawn in a small cove, hearing only subtle movement of water against rock, the mind becomes aware of its own presence more acutely. Isolation does not mean absence of connection. It means connection is filtered, reduced, framed. That framing sharpens perception. As we continue exploring the world's most secluded bays, this psychological dimension becomes inseparable from geology and biology. The shape of the land influences water flow. Water flow shapes ecosystems. Ecosystems and physical boundaries shape human perception. The fascination with isolated bays is not accidental. It emerges from deep responses to enclosure, scale, quiet, and transition. At the edge of contained water, where land curves inward and the horizon narrows, something shifts internally. The world feels smaller and more expansive at the same time. And within that contained space between cliff and tide, the human mind finds both shelter and perspective, drawn repeatedly to places where the boundary between isolation and connection is visible in the shape of the shore itself. At first glance, isolated bays appear protected by their own geography. Steep cliffs, narrow entrances, long distances from cities, or shallow sills seem to act as natural barriers. It is easy to assume that remoteness equals safety, that if a place is difficult to reach, it must be shielded from harm. But isolation does not guarantee resilience. In many cases, it makes ecosystems more fragile. When water exchange is limited, recovery from disturbance slows. When populations are small and gene flow reduced, adaptive capacity narrows. When circulation is constrained, pollutants linger longer. The same boundaries that create uniqueness can also amplify vulnerability. Consider coral systems in semi-enclosed tropical basins like Chenderawasi Bay. Coral reefs here benefit from relatively low industrial development nearby. Yet if a marine heatwave raises temperatures beyond tolerance thresholds, enclosed waters may retain heat longer than the open coastlines. Reduced flushing can delay cooling. Bleaching events in contained systems can therefore persist, stressing corals for extended periods. If recovery depends on larval influx from outside reefs, limited connectivity may slow recolonization. In hypersaline environments such as Shark Bay, salinity gradients maintain rare biological communities like stromatolites. Small alterations in water flow, caused by dredging or construction, could shift salinity levels enough to disrupt long-standing ecological balance. Because these systems operate near physiological limits for many species, slight changes can have outsized effects. In Arctic basins like Disco Bay, warming temperatures reduce sea ice duration. Ice-dependent species such as certain seals rely on stable platforms for breeding. Shorter ice seasons compress reproductive windows. Changes ripple through the food web. Isolation here does not prevent climate change impacts. It can intensify them by limiting species movement to more favourable habitats. Even in well-studied estuaries like Chesapeake Bay, internal stratification amplifies nutrient-related stress. Excess nitrogen and phosphorus entering from upstream accumulate in deeper layers. Hypoxic zones expand during summer. Fish kills occur not because the bay is exposed, but because it is partially enclosed. Conservation in remote bays must account for internal dynamics as much as external threats. One challenge lies in perception. Remote systems often receive less immediate attention because visible damage is less obvious. There may be no large industrial complexes nearby, no dense urban skyline, yet global forces do not respect geographic boundaries. Atmospheric carbon dioxide drives ocean acidification everywhere. Plastic debris carried by currents can enter even narrow entrances. Long-range pollutants travel through air and water. In semi-enclosed bays, plastics and debris can accumulate in eddies or calmer interior zones. Removal becomes logistically difficult if access is limited. Overfishing poses another risk. In remote areas where enforcement capacity is low, illegal or unregulated fishing can deplete populations before monitoring systems detect decline. Small fish populations in isolated bays are particularly susceptible to overharvest because replenishment from outside is limited. A species reduced below reproductive thresholds may take decades to recover. Marine protected areas have been established in several isolated bays to address these vulnerabilities. In Chenderawasi Bay, national park status aims to safeguard whale sharks and coral reefs. Regulations restrict certain fishing practices and encourage responsible tourism. In Shark Bay, World Heritage designation supports management efforts, protecting seagrass meadows and stromatolites. Protection alone is not enough. Monitoring must be continuous. Data on water temperature, salinity, oxygen levels and species abundance inform adaptive management. Community involvement is essential. In many remote bays, local communities depend directly on marine resources. Conservation strategies must integrate livelihood considerations. Mangrove restoration projects in sheltered coves can enhance resilience by stabilising sediment and improving water quality. Seagrass transplantation efforts aim to rebuild nursery habitats. In colder systems, limiting shipping traffic through sensitive areas reduces risk of oil spills or invasive species introduction. Semi-enclosed basins are particularly vulnerable to contamination because pollutants can remain trapped. Oil spills in isolated bays can have prolonged impacts. Reduced water exchange slows dispersal. Shorelines may be steep and difficult to access for cleanup. Climate adaptation strategies must consider microclimates within bays. Shaded sections or deeper basins may serve as refuges during heat events. Identifying and protecting such areas increases overall resilience. In some regions, researchers have proposed establishing no anchor zones to prevent damage to fragile benthic habitats in narrow inlets. Acoustic conservation is also relevant. Maintaining low noise levels in remote bays preserves communication pathways for marine mammals and fish. Education plays a role in sustaining conservation outcomes. Visitors drawn to scenic isolated bays must understand that calm water does not equal durability. Tourism, while economically beneficial, introduces pressure. Boat traffic, waste discharge, and shoreline construction alter physical and biological conditions. Balancing access with preservation requires strict guidelines and enforcement. Remote bays also serve as reference sites. Because they experience fewer direct human disturbances, they provide comparative baselines against which to measure degraded systems elsewhere. However, as global change accelerates, even these reference sites shift. Baselines must be updated continuously. Isolation can sometimes provide a buffer. Narrow entrances may slow the spread of invasive species. Limited freshwater inflow may reduce pollutant accumulation compared to heavily urbanized estuaries. But reliance on natural barriers alone is insufficient. Human activity at broader scales reaches even the most secluded waters. Conservation planning increasingly integrates connectivity analysis. Understanding how larvae move between bays and open coastlines informs network design for marine protected areas. In isolated bays with low connectivity, protection of internal breeding populations becomes especially important. Scientific research supports conservation by identifying critical habitats, spawning grounds, and unique species assemblages. Technological advances, including satellite monitoring and autonomous sensors, enhance surveillance of remote areas. Enforcement remains challenging. Patrol vessels may be limited. Weather can restrict oversight. Partnerships between governments, NGOs, researchers, and local communities improve effectiveness. Long-term resilience depends on maintaining ecological functions, nutrient cycling, predator-prey balance, habitat complexity. Isolation creates unique systems. It also reduces redundancy. If a key species disappears, replacement may not arrive quickly from outside. Fragility in these bays stems from specialization. Organisms adapted to narrow salinity ranges, stable temperatures, or specific acoustic environments may struggle if those parameters shift. Standing on the shoreline of a remote bay, it is tempting to assume that distance equals permanence, that because few people visit, the ecosystem remains unchanged. Yet satellite data show warming trends even in high-latitude fjords. Coral bleaching has reached remote reefs. Microplastics have been detected in Arctic waters. Conservation in remote bays must therefore operate at two scales simultaneously: local management and global mitigation. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions globally influences temperature stability locally. Managing fishing pressure locally enhances resilience against global stresses. The quiet surface of an isolated bay can conceal delicate balances beneath. Seagrass meadows storing carbon, microbial mats building slowly over centuries, deep basins accumulating sediment layers that record climate history. Preserving these fragile worlds requires recognition that isolation is not immunity. It is a condition that shapes vulnerability as much as uniqueness. As our journey through the world's most secluded bays continues, conservation becomes less an afterthought and more a central theme. The boundaries that define these places offer beauty and distinctiveness. They also require deliberate protection. Within contained waters shaped by geography, life persists according to narrow tolerances and slow renewal cycles. Safeguarding these systems ensures that isolation remains a source of diversity and insight, rather than a factor that accelerates loss when pressures mount beyond what the boundaries can absorb. When we stand at the edge of an isolated bay, we often assume we understand it. The surface is visible, the shoreline curves predictably. We may even know the species that swim near the top few meters, but beneath that familiarity, depth introduces uncertainty. And in enclosed waters, depth can feel more mysterious than in the open ocean. Isolation above does not always mean emptiness below. In fact, semi-enclosed systems can conceal biological and geological complexity that remains largely unobserved. In steep fjords such as Milford Sound, water plunges hundreds of meters beneath a narrow surface channel. Light fades quickly. Freshwater layers near the top give way to darker, colder saltwater below. Beyond recreational diving depths, little is seen without specialised equipment. Remote-operated vehicles lowered into such basins reveal rock walls extending downward into dim space, sponges attached to vertical faces. Sea stars move slowly across sediment, organisms live in conditions that, from the surface, would seem unlikely in a bay accessible by kayak. In Arctic systems like Disco Bay, deep basins receive limited sunlight for much of the year. Organic material sinks from seasonal plankton blooms, feeding benthic communities in near darkness. Cold temperatures slow metabolism. Life persists at a measured pace. Because circulation is restricted by shallow sills, deep water renewal may occur only during specific events. When dense ocean water flows inward under certain conditions, it replaces older basin water. Between those renewal events, chemical gradients can develop. Oxygen levels shift. Nutrient concentrations change. Within these stable but isolated conditions, microbial communities adapt. Bacteria capable of metabolizing sulfur or methane may dominate in oxygen-poor layers. These processes occur invisibly, yet they shape overall ecosystem function. In tropical basins such as Chenderawasi Bay, deeper offshore areas remain underexplored compared to coral-rich shallows. Mesophotic reefs, existing at intermediate depths where light is reduced but not absent, may host species distinct from those in brighter zones. Because diving limitations restrict direct observation, much of this deeper habitat has been mapped only recently using sonar and submersibles. Each expedition reveals new structural complexity, ridges, drop-offs, submerged pinnacles. In limestone systems like Halong Bay, underwater caves extend beyond visible entrances. Some connect interior lagoons to the broader bay through submerged tunnels. Water movement through these passages is limited and tidal dependent. Inside such caves, light vanishes entirely. Organisms living there adapt to darkness. Certain fish species lose pigmentation over evolutionary timescales in fully enclosed cave systems. While most marine caves in coastal bays remain partially connected, they still host specialized communities.
The question of whether we are alone in these depths is not philosophical in the abstract sense. It is biological. How many species remain undocumented? How many interactions occur beyond routine survey zones? In many isolated bays, research effort has focused on accessible areas, shallow reefs, shoreline vegetation, charismatic megafauna. Deep basins receive less attention because of cost and logistical constraints. Sediment cores extracted from deep sections sometimes reveal unusual chemical signatures suggesting microbial processes not fully characterized. DNA sequencing of water samples, known as environmental DNA analysis, has begun to detect traces of species not directly observed. Acoustic monitoring occasionally captures sounds not immediately attributable to known species. While most such signals can be traced to fish or marine mammals, the acoustic landscape still holds elements not fully cataloged. Isolation may foster endemism at depth. Reduced gene flow and stable environmental conditions can allow unique lineages to persist. In certain fjords, cold-water corals form deep reefs far below the surface. These corals do not rely on symbiotic algae and therefore do not require sunlight. Their presence in semi-enclosed basins challenges assumptions that significant reef structure is limited to tropical shallows. Hydrothermal activity is rare but possible in tectonically active regions. If present in isolated bays, such features could support chemosynthetic communities independent of surface productivity. The human perception of emptiness in deep water often reflects limitation of sight rather than absence of life. Light attenuates rapidly. Beyond a few tens of meters in turbid water, visibility declines sharply. In still stratified bays, thermoclines create shimmering boundaries that distort vision. Descending through such layers feels like crossing into a different space. Even shallow isolated lagoons may conceal unexpected diversity within sediment. Burrowing organisms leave subtle traces. Polychaete worms, small crustaceans, and microorganisms form intricate food webs invisible from above. Shipwrecks resting in deeper sections add artificial complexity. Over time, they become substrates for colonization. Sponges, corals, and fish inhabit metal and wood structures. Isolation complicates exploration. Narrow entrances may restrict large research vessels. Seasonal ice cover may limit access windows. Storm patterns may shorten field campaigns. Technological advances are gradually reducing these barriers. Compact, remotely operated vehicles can now be deployed from smaller boats. High-resolution sonar maps bathymetry in detail previously unavailable. Yet even with improved tools, exploration remains partial. Mapping reveals structure, but biological surveys require time and repeated visits. In many semi-enclosed bays, baseline species inventories remain incomplete. Small cryptic species evade detection. Genetic analysis may reveal cryptic species, complexes previously grouped as single taxa. Isolation also influences evolutionary novelty. In stable, low-disturbance environments, slow but steady divergence can occur. Unique adaptations to local chemical or temperature conditions may arise. The deeper unknown extends beyond species lists. Biogeochemical cycles operating at depth influence surface conditions indirectly. Nutrient regeneration in deep sediment layers contributes to productivity when mixing events occur. Oxygen depletion in deep basins can alter nitrogen cycling pathways. These processes affect overall ecosystem stability. From a human perspective, the unknown often evokes imagination. In isolated bays framed by cliffs and fog, depth feels amplified. Standing on a small boat over dark water in a fjord, one may sense vertical scale not visible to the eye. The surface appears calm, but beneath lies hundreds of meters of layered water and sediment. Isolation intensifies this perception because boundaries are clear horizontally while depth remains concealed vertically. Even in relatively shallow systems like Shark Bay, hypersaline pockets create microbial communities unlike those in surrounding waters. The unknown here is microscopic rather than abyssal. The question of being alone in these waters is therefore less about large undiscovered creatures and more about unexamined processes. Which microbial interactions sustain stromatolites? How do nutrient pulses travel through enclosed basins? What undiscovered symbioses persist in low-light zones? As research continues, some mysteries will narrow. Species will be cataloged, depth maps refined, chemical gradients understood more clearly. Yet isolation ensures that complete knowledge remains unlikely. Limited exchange and restricted access create systems that are internally complex and externally subtle. In every isolated bay, beneath visible boundaries of land and water, lies a vertical dimension where uncertainty persists. We are not alone in these depths. Life exists in forms adapted to darkness, pressure, cold, or chemical gradients. The unknown lies not in absence, but in scale and detail beyond routine perception. As we move toward the final stretch of our exploration, the deep unknown reminds us that isolation does not simplify a system. It concentrates it. It layers it. It contains processes that continue regardless of how often we visit. Beneath calm surfaces, in enclosed basins shaped by ancient geology, complexity endures quietly, awaiting careful observation and patient exploration. If you have followed this journey from glacial fjords to limestone labyrinths, from hypersaline basins to drowned forests, you may have noticed something quiet but persistent. Every isolated bay, no matter how distant or familiar, carries two identities at once. It is part of the ocean, and it is apart from it. Standing at the water's edge of such a place changes how scale feels. The wider sea lies beyond the curve of land, connected through currents that move steadily whether we see them or not. Yet here in this contained space, motion slows, sound settles, boundaries are visible. Isolation, we have seen, is rarely absolute. Even the most remote fjord remains connected through deep channels. Even hypersaline lagoons exchange water through narrow passages. Even Arctic basins receive migratory visitors. But the degree of separation matters. It shapes biology, it shapes chemistry, it shapes perception. In Disco Bay, ice defines the pace of life. In Shark Bay, salinity protects ancient microbial communities. In Milford Sound, rainfall and steep walls create vertical ecosystems that compress depth into shallow zones. In Halong Bay, limestone towers fragment water into countless microenclosures. In Chenderawasi Bay, curvature and circulation allow giants to linger beneath the surface. Each example reveals a variation on a theme. Boundaries limit exchange. Limited exchange alters timing. Altered timing reshapes adaptation. Adaptation creates uniqueness. When we think of isolation, we often imagine emptiness. But in these bays, isolation produces concentration rather than absence. Nutrients accumulate. Genetic lineages diverge. Sound echoes more distinctly. Microclimates stabilize. Sediment layers preserve memory. At the water's edge, it becomes clear that isolation is not simply distance from human presence. It is a structural condition, a narrowing of pathways, a filtering of what enters and what leaves. This filtering has consequences. It protects, it amplifies, it slows, it intensifies. Consider the ecological clocks that tick according to renewal rates rather than calendar dates. Consider the acoustic chambers formed by steep rock walls. Consider the fragile balance maintained in hypersaline or stratified systems. These processes unfold because boundaries exist, yet boundaries are not permanent. Sea levels rise, storm patterns shift, human activity expands. A narrow entrance can widen, a calm interior can become busier. The future of isolated bays depends on how those boundaries respond to change. Climate change will alter ice cover in Arctic systems. It will influence evaporation rates in arid regions. It will intensify rainfall in some temperate basins and reduce it in others. Each shift interacts with existing isolation. In some cases, isolation may buffer against rapid transformation. In others, it may increase vulnerability by slowing recovery. At a human level, the fascination with these bays reflects more than aesthetic appreciation. It reflects recognition of contained complexity. We are drawn to places where the world feels reduced to a manageable frame without losing depth. Standing on a quiet shoreline at dusk, watching light fade across still water, there is a subtle awareness that what lies within that curve of land operates according to rules not immediately visible. The absence of constant motion invites observation. Small ripples become noticeable. A distant splash stands out. The gradual shift of tide along rock faces becomes apparent. Isolation sharpens perception. It also sharpens responsibility. Because these systems are contained, their thresholds may be crossed more easily. A nutrient surge, a temperature spike, an invasive species introduction can have disproportionate effects. Conservation, therefore, is not only about protecting scenery, it is about maintaining the internal processes that define these bays. When science arrives by boat, it seeks to understand those processes. When communities manage fishing pressure or tourism, they influence renewal cycles and population stability. The boundary between isolation and connection is delicate. At the water's edge, that boundary is visible. The entrance to a fjord framed by cliffs, the shallow sill separating basin from open sea, the narrow cave linking lagoon to bay, the peninsulas enclosing a tropical basin. These physical structures remind us that separation and connection coexist. Even psychologically, the edge of a bay creates a threshold state. You stand on solid ground, looking at contained water that opens outward. You are aware of both enclosure and openness simultaneously. Perhaps that dual awareness explains why isolated bays remain compelling across cultures and centuries. They offer perspective without overwhelming scale. They provide refuge without complete detachment. The ocean beyond remains vast, dynamic, and interconnected. Within the bay, processes unfold at a pace shaped by geography. As our exploration concludes, the image of standing at that edge lingers. Water rests within defined contours. The sky reflects across a contained surface. Beneath, layers of history, biology, and chemistry operate quietly. Isolation here is not loneliness. It is specificity. It is the difference between a river and an eddy, between open horizon and curved shoreline. In these secluded bays, the world becomes concentrated. Patterns become traceable. Boundaries become instructive. And as you imagine yourself at the edge of one such place, perhaps in early morning light or fading evening calm, the idea of isolation shifts from separation to focus, from absence to detail. The bay does not detach from the ocean, it refines it. Within its contained waters, life persists according to rules shaped by land and sea together. And at the water's edge, where those rules meet observation, the quiet depth of isolation remains visible, steady, and enduring.